Welcome. Get comfortable. Let your body settle into wherever you are right now. Take a slow breath in and let it out. Tonight, we're going to spend some time together exploring a topic that has quietly fascinated people for centuries: biblical prophecy, and the way it intersects with the world we live in. There's no rush here, no urgency, just a calm, unhurried walk through some interesting ideas, facts, and thoughts that you can simply let wash over you as you drift toward rest. Let's begin with the foundation, the framework that shapes how millions of Christians think about prophecy and the future. At the center of that framework is a moment recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels. A moment when Jesus sat down on the Mount of Olives, overlooking Jerusalem, and his disciples came to him privately with a question. "Tell us," they said, "when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" What followed is known as the Olivet Discourse. It's found in Matthew chapter 24, in Mark chapter 13, and in Luke chapter 21. And for many Christians, it reads like a map. Many Christians view Jesus' Olivet Discourse as a prophetic outline of end-time events. It's one of the longest recorded teachings of Jesus on a single subject. In it, he describes wars and rumors of wars. He describes nation rising against nation, famines, earthquakes, persecution, false prophets, and ultimately, his own return. For those who read it as prophecy yet to be fulfilled, it functions almost like a checklist. A quiet list of things to watch for, a framework through which to observe the world. And watching the world is exactly what many people do. Among the most commonly cited signs of the last days are war, famine, pandemics, and earthquakes. These 4 have sometimes been described in connection with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse from the book of Revelation: conquest, war, famine, death. Whether one takes a literal or symbolic view of those passages, it's remarkable how enduring these 4 categories are. Turn on the news on almost any given day, in almost any given era, and you'll find at least one of them present somewhere in the world. Which raises an interesting question, one that scholars and ordinary believers have wrestled with for a very long time. Are these signs unique to our moment in history, or have they always been with us? That question, it turns out, is partly what separates the different schools of prophetic thought. There are different schools of eschatology, the study of last things, and they interpret prophecy in meaningfully different ways. The 4 main schools are generally called futurist, preterist, historicist, and idealist. The futurist view holds that most of the major prophecies in Daniel and Revelation are still ahead of us, waiting to be fulfilled at the end of history. The preterist view, by contrast, holds that many of those same prophecies were fulfilled in the 1st century, particularly in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The historicist view sees prophecy as unfolding progressively across the entire span of church history, a long, slow, continuous fulfillment playing out over the centuries. And the idealist view treats much of prophetic literature as symbolic, not tied to specific historical events at all, but conveying timeless spiritual truths about the struggle between good and evil. None of these views is new. They've been debated quietly in seminaries and study groups for centuries. And sincere, thoughtful Christians have landed in all 4 camps. It's a reminder that prophecy, perhaps more than almost any other area of theology, leaves room for genuine disagreement. Throughout history, Christians have consistently interpreted the book of Revelation through the lens of whatever crisis was happening in their own time. During the fall of Rome, some saw Revelation being fulfilled before their eyes. During the Black Death, which killed perhaps a third of Europe, many believed the end was imminent. During the world wars of the 20th century, prophecy interest surged. During the Cold War, the threat of nuclear annihilation seemed to many like the most natural backdrop imaginable for the book of Revelation. Each generation has brought its own headlines to the text. There's something almost tender about that, if you think about it. People in the middle of suffering and uncertainty, reaching for ancient words, hoping to find meaning, hoping to find that their moment in history was known about, was seen, was not random. Some ministries and teachers practice what scholars sometimes call newspaper exegesis, the practice of reading today's headlines directly alongside prophetic scripture. You may have seen this. A news story about conflict in the Middle East placed side by side with a passage from Ezekiel. A report on artificial intelligence connected to a verse about the mark of the beast. A global health crisis framed as a fulfillment of Matthew 24. For those who practice it, it feels like confirmation, a sense that the ancient text is alive and speaking to the present moment. For others, it raises questions. Is the connection genuine? Or are we finding patterns because we're looking for them? Critics of this approach warn that overconnecting current events to prophecy can have real consequences, creating anxiety, encouraging fear, and sometimes leading to specific date setting that has, historically, always proven incorrect. There is a long and somewhat sobering list of dates that were predicted as the end of the world and quietly passed without incident. Scholars have catalogued hundreds of them over the centuries. And yet, the practice continues, which perhaps tells us something about the deep human need to find meaning in chaos. To believe that history has a shape, that it's going somewhere. That need is not something to dismiss. It's profoundly human. The caution, most thoughtful voices would say, is simply to hold those connections loosely, to remain curious without becoming consumed. Interest in biblical prophecy tends to surge during specific kinds of historical moments: wars, pandemics, and periods of economic instability. Publishers who specialize in prophetic literature have noted that their sales climb sharply during times of crisis. After September 11, 2001, books on prophecy and revelation saw dramatic spikes in sales. The same happened during the 2008 financial crisis, and again during the global pandemic of 2020. There's a pattern there that has repeated itself, quietly, across centuries. When the world feels unstable, when ordinary life is disrupted, when the future feels genuinely uncertain, people reach for frameworks that offer a larger story. A sense that what is happening is not simply chaos, but part of something that was anticipated long ago. Whether that instinct is correct or not, it is, at the very least, deeply and persistently human. So that's where we begin, with the framework itself. The ancient discourse on a hillside. The schools of thought that have debated its meaning ever since. The human tendency to hold today's newspaper up to ancient words and ask, is this it? Is this the moment? There are no alarms here. No conclusions being pushed on you. Just the quiet landscape of an idea that has shaped the thinking of billions of people across 2,000 years of history. Let that sit with you gently as you breathe. If the Olivet Discourse gives us the broad framework, then for many who study biblical prophecy, there is one nation that sits at the very center of that map: Israel. More than perhaps any other subject in modern prophetic discussion, the story of Israel is the one that commentators, theologians, and ordinary believers return to again and again. It is the thread that, in their view, runs through everything else. So let's walk through it slowly. There's no rush. The establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948 is widely viewed among prophesy-minded Christians as one of the most significant prophetic milestones in history. For nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people had no sovereign homeland. Scattered across the nations following the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and the later Roman suppression of Jewish revolts, the idea of a restored Jewish state in the ancient land of Israel seemed, for most of that time, like a distant and perhaps impossible dream. And then, in a single generation, it happened. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. Within hours, the United States recognized the new nation. Within days, neighboring Arab states launched a war to prevent its survival. And yet, the state survived. For those who read passages like Ezekiel 37, the famous vision of the Valley of Dry Bones coming back to life, reassembled, restored, breathing again, the events of 1948 felt like a direct fulfillment. A nation, long scattered and long silent, breathing again on the world stage. Whether one shares that interpretation or not, it is difficult to overstate how significant that moment felt to those who witnessed it, and how significant it continues to feel to millions today. Rising international hostility toward Israel is frequently cited as fulfilling ancient prophetic predictions of global opposition to the Jewish state. There are passages in the Hebrew prophets, in Zechariah, in Joel, in Ezekiel, that describe a time when Jerusalem and Israel would be a source of international controversy. A burden, as Zechariah 12 puts it, to all the surrounding peoples. Whatever one makes of those passages, it is observable that Israel occupies an unusual place in global politics. A nation of fewer than 10 million people receives a disproportionate share of international attention, debate, and condemnation in various global forums. That observation alone, setting aside any prophetic interpretation, is something that analysts across the political spectrum have noted. For those watching through a prophetic lens, it reads as exactly what the ancient texts described. A small nation at the center of the world's attention. A flashpoint that refuses to fade quietly into the background of history. Among the specific prophetic passages most often cited today is Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, which describe a large coalition of nations, led by a power referred to as Gog, from the land of Magog, launching a military attack against Israel. Scholars have debated the identity of these nations for centuries. In modern prophetic commentary, Magog is frequently identified with Russia, based on geographical descriptions in the text and the work of various Bible scholars going back to the 19th century. Other nations mentioned in the passage have been associated with Iran, Turkey, Libya, and Sudan, countries that, notably, share certain contemporary geopolitical alignments. Whether those identifications are correct is genuinely debated. But what makes the passage remarkable to those who study it is how vividly it describes something that would have seemed almost unimaginable when Ezekiel wrote it. A restored Israel, living in relative security in its ancient homeland, suddenly threatened by a powerful coalition from the north. The geography alone has fascinated readers for generations. And in the current climate of shifting alliances and regional tensions, interest in those two chapters has never been higher. Jerusalem is widely regarded, both in prophetic literature and in practical geopolitics, as one of the most significant flashpoints in the world today. It is a city claimed by multiple peoples and multiple faiths. Jews, Christians, and Muslims each have deep historical and spiritual connections to Jerusalem and to specific sites within it. The Temple Mount, known to Muslims as the Haram al-Sharif, sits at the intersection of those claims in a way that is uniquely combustible. In prophetic thinking, Jerusalem's contested status is not seen as a modern political accident. It is seen as the fulfillment of ancient expectation. The city that the prophets said would one day draw all nations into its orbit has, in many observable ways, done exactly that. Decisions made about Jerusalem, about its status, its borders, its holy sites, have the capacity to reverberate across the entire Muslim world, across the Jewish diaspora, and across Christian communities on every continent. Few cities in human history have carried that kind of weight simultaneously. One of the quieter but genuinely remarkable stories connected to modern Israel is the revival of Hebrew as a living, spoken, national language. Hebrew, as a spoken vernacular, had effectively ceased to be used in daily life for roughly 17 centuries. It survived as a language of religious study and liturgy, read in synagogues, preserved in sacred texts, but it was not the language of the marketplace, the home, or the street. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, largely through the work of one man, a Lithuanian Jewish scholar named Eliezer ben Yehuda, Hebrew was systematically revived and modernized. New vocabulary was created for concepts that hadn't existed when the language was last spoken. And by the time the State of Israel was established, Hebrew was the living, breathing mother tongue of an entire population. Linguists consider it one of the most extraordinary events in the entire history of human language. No other extinct vernacular has ever been successfully revived as a national language on this scale. For those reading through a prophetic lens, it resonates with passages like Zephaniah 3 verse 9, which speaks of a restored people given a pure language. Whether or not that connection is intended, the historical fact itself is genuinely stunning. Archaeological discoveries connected to the biblical text continue to draw global attention to the land of Israel, quietly reinforcing the historical rootedness of the stories recorded in Scripture. In recent decades, archaeologists working in Israel and the surrounding region have unearthed inscriptions bearing the names of biblical kings, figures once dismissed by some scholars as legendary. The Tel Dan stele, discovered in northern Israel in 1993, contains the earliest known extra-biblical reference to the House of David. The Siloam Tunnel inscription corroborates the account in 2 Kings of King Hezekiah's waterworks during the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem. The ancient city of Jericho, the Pool of Siloam mentioned in the Gospel of John, and numerous first-century sites in and around Jerusalem have all yielded discoveries that align closely with the biblical narrative. None of this settles questions of faith. Archaeology rarely does. But it does mean that the land itself continues to surface its own quiet testimony, layer by layer, dig by dig, and that testimony consistently places Israel at the center of the story it claims to tell. There's something almost meditative about thinking of that land, ancient and young at the same time. A place where the oldest stories in Western civilization are still being uncovered from the soil, while new headlines are written above ground every single day. Whatever your beliefs, it is a remarkable piece of the world to contemplate as you settle into rest. A small strip of land on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea, carrying the weight of the world's oldest arguments and its most enduring hopes. Let that image sit softly with you. We've been thinking about Israel, that small, ancient, endlessly contested land sitting at the center of so much prophetic thought. And as we move outward from that center, we begin to notice something. The world around Israel is shifting. Not suddenly, not all at once, but slowly, steadily, the way tectonic plates move, invisibly, quietly, until one day the landscape looks different than it did before. For those who study biblical prophecy, these shifts are not random. They are pieces of a larger picture. And tonight, we're simply going to look at some of those pieces together, calmly, without drawing sharp conclusions. Just observing. Just noticing. For as long as there have been nations, there have been alliances. And for as long as there have been prophecy students, those alliances have been held up against the ancient texts to see whether the shapes match. The book of Daniel describes a succession of great empires. Revelation speaks of kings of the East, of powerful commercial and political systems with global reach. Ezekiel's coalition of nations marching against Israel includes powers from multiple directions. Taken together, these passages have led generations of readers to watch the formation of political blocs with a particular kind of attention. Today, that attention is fixed on a world that is reorganizing itself in ways that would have been difficult to predict even a few decades ago. Old alliances are fraying. New ones are forming. Nations that were once firmly in one camp are quietly hedging their bets, building relationships on multiple sides simultaneously. The broad outlines of a multipolar world, one no longer organized simply around a single dominant Western power, are becoming clearer with each passing year. And for those reading through a prophetic lens, that reorganization looks less like political noise and more like the slow assembly of a final stage. One of the most frequently discussed developments in prophetic circles is the political consolidation of Europe. Since the middle of the 20th century, the nations of Europe have been engaged in an unprecedented experiment, binding themselves together economically, legally, and in some ways politically, into a single integrated bloc. For many prophecy commentators, this process has carried symbolic weight that goes beyond economics. The Roman Empire, after all, once unified that same stretch of the European continent under single authority. And the Book of Daniel, in its famous vision of a statue with different materials representing successive empires, has long been interpreted as pointing toward a final revival of Roman-style power in the last days. Whether the European Union is that revival or merely a forerunner of it, is something interpreters disagree on. The EU has faced significant internal stress, the departure of Britain, the strains of the sovereign debt crisis, the pressures of mass migration. It has looked, at various moments, both more unified and more fragile than its founders imagined. But the basic trajectory, toward greater integration, greater shared governance, greater collective weight in global affairs, continues. And for those watching through a prophetic lens, the direction of travel matters as much as the current destination. Meanwhile, the Middle East itself continues to grow in strategic importance in ways that feel almost disproportionate to its size. The region sits at the intersection of 3 continents. It holds a significant portion of the world's known energy reserves. It contains some of the world's most sensitive religious sites. And it is surrounded by nations with complicated histories, competing ambitions, and, in several cases, significant military capabilities. Prophecy has always been geographically focused on this part of the world. The great battles described in Daniel and Revelation are not set in the Americas or in East Asia. They are set in and around the ancient Near East, in the vicinity of Israel, the Euphrates River, and the valley of Megiddo, from which we get the word Armageddon. The fact that this same geography remains, in the 21st century, one of the most strategically contested regions on the planet is something that observers across many different frameworks find striking. Whatever one believes about the prophetic texts, the Middle East has an enduring tendency to be exactly where the most consequential things are happening. Shifting northward, something quieter but significant has been unfolding in the Arctic. What was once a frozen and largely inaccessible expanse is becoming, as temperatures rise and ice retreats, a zone of genuine geopolitical competition. Russia has been expanding its military presence in the Arctic for years, reopening Soviet-era bases, deploying new classes of submarines, and asserting territorial claims over vast stretches of the Arctic seabed. Other nations, the United States, Canada, Norway, Denmark, China, are watching that expansion carefully and responding with their own investments. The Arctic contains an estimated quarter of the world's undiscovered oil and gas reserves. As sea routes through the Arctic become navigable for longer portions of the year, they also offer shipping lanes that could reshape global trade. The combination of military positioning and resource competition in that region represents the emergence of a genuinely new theater of great power rivalry. For those attentive to prophetic references to powers from the far north, these developments register with particular interest. The ancient descriptions of northern powers descending toward the Middle East take on a different quality when the great northern power of our era is actively expanding its reach southward and westward. Around the world, something else has been in motion for years. Tens of millions of people are on the move. Global migration has reached levels not seen since the aftermath of the Second World War. People are moving away from conflict zones in the Middle East and Africa, away from regions experiencing the effects of environmental stress, away from economies that can no longer sustain them, and toward Europe, toward the Americas, toward wherever stability seems to offer a foothold. This movement of people is reshaping the demographics, the politics, and the social fabric of receiving nations in ways that are still being worked out. It is generating political reactions, the rise of nationalist movements in Europe, border tensions in the Americas, heated debates about identity and belonging in nations that thought they knew who they were. Some prophecy commentators see in these great waves of human movement the kind of upheaval that historically precedes larger shifts. A world in which millions of people are displaced and in motion is a world whose political and social structures are under strain. And strained structures, historically, tend eventually to break and reform into new shapes. Underneath all of this, underneath the alliances and the migrations and the military posturing, there are three things that the world is quietly organizing itself around. Three resources that, more than ideology or religion or nationalism, are shaping the conflicts and competitions of the 21st century. Energy, water, and trade corridors. Who controls the oil and gas? Who controls the rivers and the aquifers? Who controls the straits and the ports and the roads through which goods move? These are the real engines of geopolitical tension in our time. The wars and near-wars of recent decades, in the Persian Gulf, in Central Asia, along the Nile River Basin, in the South China Sea, can almost all be traced back, in part, to competition over one or more of these three things. For students of prophecy, this convergence of competition around a specific geography, one that overlaps significantly with the lands described in the ancient texts, feels like more than coincidence. The Euphrates River, specifically mentioned in Revelation as a site of end-time events, runs through one of the most water-stressed and energy-rich regions on Earth. The trade corridors of the ancient Near East are, once again, among the most contested on the planet. The world is not standing still. It hasn't been for a long time. And whether one reads these realignments through a prophetic lens or simply through the lens of history and geopolitics, the picture that emerges is of a world in the middle of a significant transition. Old orders softening, new ones not yet fully formed. It's a lot to hold in your mind. So don't try to hold all of it. Just let it drift past you like clouds. Large, slow-moving shapes crossing a wide sky. You don't have to name them all or figure out where they're going. You can simply rest beneath them. We've been watching the world rearrange itself. The alliances shifting, the migrations flowing, the competitions over energy and water and trade quietly intensifying beneath the surface of the daily news. And as we look at all of that movement, a question begins to form on its own. Where is it all going? Not in an anxious way, just as an observation. When you watch pieces moving on a board long enough, you start to notice that they aren't moving randomly. There seems to be a direction, a gravitational pull toward something. For many who study biblical prophecy, that pull has a name. And tonight we're going to look at it calmly, with open hands, the way you might examine something interesting you found on a long, quiet walk. The prophetic texts, particularly Daniel and Revelation, describe a future in which power becomes concentrated. Not scattered across dozens of competing nations the way it largely is today, but gathered, unified, expressed through a single authority with reach that extends across the known world. For most of Christian history, that description seemed almost fantastical. The ancient world had empires, yes, but true global governance, a system with genuine authority over the entire planet, was practically inconceivable. The distances were too great, the communications too slow, the logistics too impossible. And then, across the span of roughly a century, the infrastructure for exactly that kind of system began to be built. The League of Nations after the First World War, the United Nations after the Second, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization. Each of these institutions was created, in good faith, to solve real problems that individual nations couldn't solve alone. And each of them, in the process, required member nations to cede some measure of sovereignty, to agree that on certain matters, a body above the level of the nation-state would have authority. For prophecy teachers watching that architecture take shape across the decades, it looked less like a series of pragmatic policy decisions and more like the gradual construction of a platform. A framework that, once in place, could one day support something much more centralized than its architects intended. Woven into this broader story is something that has been accelerating for decades, the softening of national borders. Not their elimination, exactly, but their gradual loosening. Their transformation from hard walls into something more permeable. The European Union's Schengen area allows people to move freely across more than 24 national borders without a passport check. International trade agreements have reduced the barriers through which goods and capital move. Digital technology has made national borders essentially invisible for the flow of information, money, and influence. Some see this as simple progress, the natural evolution of a more connected, more cooperative world. Others, particularly those reading through a prophetic lens, see something more deliberate in the direction of travel. A slow dissolving of the nation-state as the primary unit of human organization. A world in which the question of who governs is being quietly transferred upward, to bodies and systems that no single population elected and no single government fully controls. Whether that transfer is benign or concerning depends very much on one's values and one's framework. But the transfer itself is observable. It is happening, gradually and somewhat invisibly, in the background of daily life. What has made this process accelerate, perhaps more than anything else, is crisis. There is a pattern that has become visible across the past few decades. A major crisis emerges, a financial collapse, a pandemic, a climate event, a security threat. And almost immediately, the response gravitates toward centralization, toward coordination. Toward the argument that this problem is too large for any one nation to handle alone, and that what is needed is a unified, internationally coordinated response. That argument is often correct. Many problems genuinely are too large for individual nations to solve in isolation. But the institutional infrastructure built to manage each crisis tends to persist long after the crisis has passed. The emergency powers, the coordinating bodies, the shared data systems, they rarely fully dissolve. They become the new baseline, the new normal. And the next crisis begins from a slightly more centralized starting point than the last one did. For those tracking this pattern through a prophetic lens, it reads as a ratchet. Each turn tightening the mechanism a little further. Each emergency leaving behind a slightly more integrated global governance architecture than existed before. Sitting at the heart of that architecture is money. And the institutions that govern how money moves around the world have grown, quietly, into some of the most powerful entities on the planet. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank between them have the ability to shape the economic destinies of entire nations. Their loan conditions, their policy recommendations, their assessments of a country's creditworthiness, these things determine whether governments can borrow, whether currencies hold their value, whether populations experience stability or crisis. The Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, sometimes called the Central Bank of Central Banks, coordinates monetary policy among the world's major central banks in ways that are largely invisible to ordinary people but profoundly consequential for everyone. Decisions made in its quiet meeting rooms ripple outward into mortgage rates, employment levels, and the price of food in countries whose citizens have never heard of it. For those who read Revelation's descriptions of a future economic system with the power to control who can buy and who can sell, the existence of institutions with this kind of reach is something worth sitting with quietly. Not with alarm, just with thoughtful attention. Alongside these institutional concentrations of power, something parallel has been happening in the private sector. The corporate world has been consolidating for decades. Through mergers and acquisitions, through the natural advantages that accrue to dominant platforms, through the network effects that tend to make large systems larger, economic power has been gathering into fewer and fewer hands. A small number of technology companies now mediate a significant portion of human communication, commerce, and information access. A handful of asset management firms collectively hold ownership stakes in the majority of the world's major corporations. Supply chains that once involved dozens of independent actors have been rationalized into systems controlled by a small number of dominant players. This concentration is not unique to our era. There have been periods of significant corporate consolidation before, and they have always eventually met with some form of correction or disruption. But the scale of the current consolidation, and the degree to which it spans national borders and eludes the regulatory reach of any single government, does feel different in kind, not just degree. A world in which a small number of entities control the infrastructure of daily economic life is a world that looks, in its broad outlines, rather like some of the systems that prophetic literature describes. And binding all of it together, operating invisibly beneath everything we buy and sell and borrow and invest, are the global financial markets. A system so interconnected, so synchronized, that it now effectively operates as a single continuous organism across all 24 hours of the day. When markets open in Tokyo, they are already responding to what happened in New York the night before. When London opens, it picks up the thread from Asia. When New York opens, it inherits the mood of the European session. Around and around, without pause, without sleep, the flow of capital circles the planet in a loop that never fully stops. This synchronization means that a shock anywhere in the system propagates everywhere almost instantly. The financial crisis of 2008 demonstrated this with uncomfortable clarity. What began as a problem in a specific segment of the American mortgage market became, within weeks, a global crisis that affected economies on every continent. The connections were simply that tight. The system was simply that integrated. For those who believe that a future global economic authority will require exactly this kind of integrated, synchronized infrastructure to exercise the kind of control described in prophetic literature, the current system does not need to be transformed into something unrecognizable. It simply needs to be directed. It's a lot to contemplate. A world knitting itself together, layer by layer. Institutions accumulating quiet authority. Corporations consolidating their reach. Markets spinning in their endless synchronized cycle. It's simply the world doing what the world does, slowly, incrementally, mostly below the threshold of daily awareness, becoming something new. And you are here, in this moment, breathing quietly, letting it all be whatever it is. There is a verse in the 13th chapter of Revelation that has fascinated and unsettled readers for nearly 2,000 years. It describes a future system in which no one can buy or sell unless they carry a specific mark. A mark of allegiance to a particular authority. A mark without which ordinary economic life becomes impossible. For most of Christian history, that passage was interpreted symbolically, or understood as something that might be fulfilled in ways difficult to fully imagine. The mechanisms for a truly global, truly enforceable economic control system simply didn't exist. Commerce was too local, too cash-based, too dependent on face-to-face transactions that no central authority could easily monitor or restrict. And then, in the space of a single generation, the mechanisms began to appear. Not all at once, not announced, just quietly, incrementally, one technological development at a time, each one introduced for entirely reasonable purposes, each one adding another layer to an infrastructure that, taken together, looks rather different from any of its individual parts. Tonight we're going to walk through that infrastructure slowly and gently, not with alarm, just with the quiet attention of someone who finds it genuinely interesting to notice where the world has arrived. We begin with identity. The most fundamental layer of any control system is knowing who someone is. For most of human history, identity was a largely local and informal affair. You were known by your neighbors, by your community, by the people you did business with. Official identity documents, passports, birth certificates, national identity cards are, in historical terms, relatively recent inventions. And for most of their existence, they were paper-based, easily forged, and difficult to verify across borders. That is changing rapidly. Digital identity systems, government-issued, biometrically verified, linked to a unique identifier that follows a person across every interaction with official systems, are being rolled out in countries across the world. India's Aadhaar system has enrolled over 1 billion people, linking fingerprints and iris scans to a 12-digit number that functions as a universal identifier for government services, banking, and beyond. The European Union is developing a unified digital identity framework for its member states. Dozens of other nations are in various stages of similar programs. The stated purposes are practical and largely benign: reducing fraud, improving access to services, streamlining bureaucracy. And in many respects they do exactly that. But they also create something that has never existed before at this scale: a verified, biometrically anchored digital identity for each enrolled individual. An identity that is, by design, extremely difficult to falsify and extremely easy to check. For those who read prophetic literature carefully, the arrival of robust, scalable identity verification infrastructure is worth noting. Not because it is sinister in itself, but because it is a prerequisite for the kind of system that the ancient text describes. Layered on top of identity infrastructure is the question of how money moves. And here, the changes of the past 2 decades have been nothing short of revolutionary. Cash, physical, anonymous, untraceable cash, is in long-term decline across much of the developed world. Sweden has come close to eliminating it almost entirely. In China, digital payment systems have become so dominant that many small businesses no longer accept physical currency at all. In the United States, the United Kingdom, and across Europe, contactless payments, mobile wallets, and online transactions now account for a majority of consumer spending. Each of these transactions, unlike a cash exchange, leaves a record, a timestamp, a location, a buyer and a seller, a product or service, all of it logged, stored, and in principle accessible to whoever operates or regulates the system through which it passed. Central banks around the world are now actively developing what are called central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. Digital versions of national currencies issued directly by central banks, operating on government-controlled infrastructure designed to eventually replace or supplement physical cash. China has already launched a digital yuan. The European Central Bank is developing a digital euro. The United States Federal Reserve has been studying the possibility of a digital dollar for several years. A CBDC is not simply a digital payment system like the ones that already exist. It is a programmable currency, one that could, in principle, be designed with rules built directly into it. Rules about where it can be spent, when it expires, what categories of purchase it permits or restricts. The technical capability for that level of programmability exists. Whether it would ever be used that way is a policy question. But the infrastructure, once built, carries the potential within it. Running alongside digital currency is a technology that has become one of the defining concepts of the past decade. Blockchain, the distributed ledger system that underlies cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, was originally conceived as a tool for financial freedom, a decentralized system that no single authority could control or manipulate. The irony is that the same underlying technology has become the foundation for identity and transaction tracking systems of remarkable thoroughness. A blockchain record is permanent, tamper-resistant, and in principle complete. Every transaction ever made on a given blockchain is preserved in the ledger forever, visible to anyone with access. Governments and international bodies have been exploring blockchain-based identity and credential systems for years. The concept of a digital identity credential, a verified record of who you are, what qualifications you hold, what transactions you have made, what your health status is, stored on a distributed ledger and accessible to authorized parties anywhere in the world, is not science fiction. It is an active area of development in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. The same technology that was meant to liberate financial activity from central control turns out, in the hands of those who hold authority over the systems, to be an extraordinarily powerful tool for the comprehensive tracking of human economic life. And it is not only financial life that is being tracked. The capacity of governments and large corporations to monitor populations has expanded so dramatically in the past 2 decades that it has outpaced the ability of legal frameworks, ethical guidelines, and public understanding to keep up with it. Smartphones carry with them a continuous record of their owner's location, communications, browsing history, purchasing behavior, and social connections. Smart home devices listen passively in living rooms and kitchens. Facial recognition cameras are deployed in public spaces across dozens of countries, most extensively in China, where an estimated several hundred million cameras form a surveillance network of a scale that has no precedent in human history. Data brokers collect, aggregate, and sell profiles of individual consumers that include thousands of data points, inferences about health, politics, religion, relationships, finances, and psychology drawn from the digital trails that ordinary life inevitably produces. None of this requires a conspiracy. It is simply the aggregate result of millions of individual technological and commercial decisions, each made for its own particular reason, accumulating into a system of population monitoring that would have been the envy of every authoritarian government in history. The infrastructure through which all of this data flows has itself been undergoing a transformation. The rollout of fifth-generation mobile networks, 5G, and the ongoing development of the technologies that will follow it are creating a communications infrastructure of unprecedented density and speed. 5G is not simply faster 4G. It is a fundamentally different kind of network, designed to connect not just phones and computers, but the full range of physical objects that make up what technologists call the Internet of Things. Vehicles, medical devices, industrial equipment, smart city infrastructure, all of it communicating, in real time, through a network dense enough to handle the data load. The practical consequences of this infrastructure for surveillance and monitoring capabilities are significant. A world in which the physical environment itself is networked, in which sensors are embedded in the street furniture, the vehicles, the buildings, and the devices of daily life, is a world in which the movement and behavior of populations can be tracked with a granularity that no previous surveillance system could approach. And then there is the simple, astonishing fact of global simultaneous media. There is a passage in Revelation chapter 11 that describes 2 witnesses lying dead in the street of Jerusalem, and the text says that people from every nation, tribe, language, and people will gaze at them. For most of Christian history, commentators puzzled over how that could possibly be literal. How could people around the entire world simultaneously witness a single event in one city? The answer, it turns out, required only a satellite uplink and a smartphone. We now live in a world where a single event, a speech, a catastrophe, an act of violence, a moment of extraordinary significance, can be seen by billions of people in real time, simultaneously, regardless of where on Earth they are. The infrastructure for the entire world to witness a single moment together now exists and is in daily use. For those who read that passage in Revelation and spent centuries wondering how it could be fulfilled, the answer arrived so quietly and so incrementally that most people barely noticed it happening at all. Technology is strange that way. It arrives in pieces, each piece useful and innocuous on its own. And then one day you look at all the pieces together and realize that something has been assembled. Something with a shape that you recognize from somewhere. There is no need to be frightened by that recognition tonight. Fear is not the point. The point is simply to notice. To be the kind of person who pays quiet attention to the world and finds it interesting. You are that kind of person. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. So let the technology do its spinning and its connecting and its tracking out there in the world, while you do the most analog thing imaginable. You breathe. You rest. You let your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts grow soft and your body remember that it knows exactly how to do this. We've been walking through the infrastructure of the modern world together. The surveillance systems, the digital currencies, the synchronized financial networks, the communication technologies that make the entire planet feel, at times, like a single room. And underneath all of that infrastructure, powering more and more of it with each passing year, something new has arrived. Something that is genuinely difficult to categorize, difficult to fully understand, and, depending on who you ask, either the most promising or the most consequential development in the history of human civilization. Artificial intelligence. It arrived gradually, and then all at once. For decades, it was a research curiosity, a promise that always seemed to be just around the next corner. And then, in a remarkably compressed span of time, it crossed thresholds that researchers had expected to take much longer. It began writing, reasoning, creating, diagnosing, deciding. And the world that had been building toward this moment suddenly found itself in it, still in the middle of figuring out what it means. Tonight we're going to sit with some of the technologies that are reshaping what it means to be human. Not with urgency, just with the quiet, wide-eyed attention that these things deserve. For those who study prophetic literature, one of the most striking aspects of artificial intelligence is not any single capability but the aggregate effect of all of them together. The Book of Revelation describes a future system of control with global reach, one capable of enforcing economic compliance, monitoring populations, and directing human behavior on a scale that requires not just authority but extraordinary logistical capacity. For most of history, the logistical requirements alone made such a system practically impossible. You cannot monitor billions of people, process billions of transactions, and enforce billions of individual compliance decisions with human bureaucrats. The numbers simply don't work. But they do work with AI. Machine learning systems can already process volumes of data, identify patterns, flag anomalies, and make or recommend decisions at speeds and scales that no human organization could approach. The same technology that recommends your next video or approves your loan application is, in its more advanced forms, capable of managing the kind of comprehensive population-scale coordination that the prophetic texts describe. This is not a prediction. It is simply an observation about capability. The infrastructure that would be required for the systems described in Revelation to function is, for the first time in history, within the range of what technology can actually deliver. Among the specific capabilities that have emerged from the AI revolution, one stands out for the particular kind of concern it raises. Deepfake technology, the ability to generate highly convincing synthetic video and audio of real people saying and doing things they never said or did, has advanced with startling speed. What began as a novelty, a curiosity, a way to put celebrities' faces into amusing video clips, has become a tool of genuine sophistication. Synthetic video of world leaders delivering speeches they never gave. Audio recordings of executives saying things they never said. Fabricated evidence planted into news cycles. The technology to produce these things is no longer confined to well-funded research labs. It is increasingly accessible. The prophetic tradition has always included warnings about deception as a hallmark of the last days. Jesus himself, in the Olivet Discourse where we began, warned specifically about false prophets and false signs capable of deceiving even the most discerning. The Book of Revelation describes a figure with the power to perform great signs and wonders, to make fire come down from heaven in the sight of all people, to produce spectacle convincing enough to lead populations astray. A world in which synthetic media can manufacture that kind of spectacle digitally and distribute it instantly to billions of people is a world in which the ancient warnings about deception take on a very contemporary texture. Beneath the surface of the AI revolution, something equally significant is quietly advancing. Quantum computing, a fundamentally different approach to computation that exploits the properties of quantum mechanics to perform certain calculations at speeds that conventional computers could never approach, is moving from theory toward practical reality. The implications for cybersecurity are profound and somewhat sobering. Most of the encryption that currently protects digital communications, financial transactions, and sensitive data is based on mathematical problems that are effectively impossible for conventional computers to solve in a reasonable time frame. Quantum computers, once they reach sufficient capability, would be able to solve those same problems with relative ease. This means that the security architecture underlying the entire digital world, the locks on every digital door, could eventually become vulnerable in ways that require complete rethinking of how information is protected. Governments, militaries, financial institutions, and intelligence agencies are well aware of this. The race to develop quantum-resistant encryption and to build quantum computers capable of breaking existing encryption is already underway. For those thinking about systems of global control, the arrival of quantum computing represents something significant. It could, in the wrong hands, render private communication effectively impossible. It could give those who possess it an intelligence and economic advantage of a kind the world has never seen. Further along the horizon, and moving toward it faster than most people realize, are technologies that do not merely change what humans can do. They begin to change what humans are. Brain-computer interfaces, devices that create a direct communication channel between the human brain and external computing systems, have moved from science fiction into early clinical reality. Companies working in this space have demonstrated systems capable of allowing paralyzed patients to control computers and robotic limbs through thought alone. The therapeutic applications are genuinely extraordinary. The ability to restore communication and mobility to people who have lost it is a profound and moving achievement. But the same interface that restores function to a paralyzed patient could, in a more advanced form, do things that raise much deeper questions. A sufficiently sophisticated brain-computer interface could, in principle, monitor the neural activity associated with thought, intention, and emotion. It could deliver inputs as well as receive them, not just reading the brain but writing to it. The boundary between the human mind and the external digital world, once crossed in one direction, becomes much harder to maintain in the other. For those who have thought carefully about what human identity means, about what it means to have a self that is genuinely one's own, these technologies raise questions that go to the very foundations of what the prophetic tradition calls the soul. Questions about autonomy, about the integrity of the inner life, about what it means to be made in the image of God rather than remade in the image of a system. Similar questions arise from the advances being made in genetic engineering and synthetic biology. The development of precise gene editing tools has made it possible to modify the DNA of living organisms, including human embryos, with a specificity and efficiency that was unimaginable a generation ago. The therapeutic promise is real. Genetic diseases that have caused suffering across generations may become treatable or preventable at the source. The ability to understand and intervene in the biological code of life is, in many respects, a magnificent achievement of human curiosity and ingenuity. But the same tools that could eliminate inherited disease could also be used to select for traits, to enhance capabilities beyond the normal human range, to blur the boundaries between species, or to create biological systems that have no natural precedent. Synthetic biology, the design and construction of biological components and systems that do not exist in nature, is moving in directions that are genuinely difficult to anticipate. For a tradition that begins with the words "in the beginning, God created," the prospect of human beings taking on the role of creator at the level of the genome carries a particular weight. The ancient prohibition in Leviticus against mixing kinds, the warnings in prophetic literature about things that transgress natural order, these find a strange new resonance in a world where the boundaries between the biological and the synthetic are being actively and deliberately dissolved. All of these threads come together in a philosophical movement that has been growing quietly in academic and technology circles for several decades. Transhumanism, the belief that human beings should use technology to transcend the limitations of the biological human condition, to extend life dramatically, enhance cognition, eliminate disease, and ultimately, in its most ambitious forms, achieve something approaching indefinite existence. The longevity research space has attracted serious scientific talent and extraordinary sums of investment capital. Researchers are working on interventions targeting the fundamental mechanisms of biological aging. Some in the field speak openly about treating aging itself as a disease to be cured. Others go further, discussing the possibility of uploading human consciousness to digital substrates, of achieving a form of existence no longer dependent on biological hardware at all. Neural implants and advanced digital interfaces sit at the intersection of these ambitions. A sufficiently advanced neural interface could, in principle, not merely augment human cognition but reshape it. Reshape identity. Reshape the loyalties, the values, the sense of self that make a person who they are. For the prophetic tradition, which has always understood human identity as something given rather than constructed, grounded in a relationship with a creator rather than in a set of capabilities to be optimized, the transhumanist project raises questions that are not merely ethical but deeply theological. What is the soul, if the mind can be edited? What is loyalty, if it can be programmed? What is worship, if identity itself is a design choice? These are large questions. Ancient questions, really, dressed in very new clothes. And they don't need to be answered tonight. They can simply be held, lightly, the way you might hold an interesting stone you picked up on a walk. Feeling its weight. Noticing its texture. Wondering about the forces that shaped it. The world is arriving somewhere it has never been before. That is undeniably true. Whether one reads that arrival through the lens of prophecy, or simply through the lens of a thoughtful person paying attention, the landscape is genuinely remarkable. And you are here, in the quiet, at the end of a long day, letting it all be interesting rather than overwhelming. That is a kind of wisdom. Your breathing is slower now. Your body is heavier. The questions of the world are doing their patient waiting out there, as they always do. We've been moving through some of the most extraordinary technological developments in human history. The artificial intelligence reshaping how decisions get made. The genetic tools rewriting the code of life itself. The neural interfaces beginning to blur the boundary between the human mind and the digital world. And underneath all of it, a quiet philosophical current pulling toward a version of humanity that looks rather different from the one that walked out of the garden. But tonight, we come back to something more immediate. Something that touches the daily life of ordinary people in ways that advanced technology, for most of us, still does not. Money, food, work, the basic materials of a human life. Because whatever one believes about the grand prophetic arc of history, the texture of that arc, the way it is actually felt by actual people, tends to show up first in the most ordinary places. In the price of groceries. In the stability of employment. In the question of whether the economic system that has organized life for generations is still holding together, or whether something underneath it is beginning to shift. Let's walk through it slowly. The global economy is carrying a weight of debt that has no precedent in recorded history. Not in any one country, but across virtually all of them simultaneously. Governments borrowed heavily to manage the financial crisis of 2008. They borrowed again, far more dramatically, to manage the economic consequences of the pandemic of 2020. Central banks held interest rates near zero for over a decade, encouraging borrowing at every level of the economic system. Governments, corporations, households, until the entire structure was built on a foundation of cheap money that could not stay cheap forever. When inflation returned, as it eventually had to, the reckoning began. Interest rates rose. The cost of servicing existing debt climbed. Governments that had borrowed freely found themselves spending larger and larger portions of their revenue simply paying interest on what they already owed. And the question that serious economists have been asking, carefully and quietly, is not whether this system is sustainable. Most agree that in its current form it is not, but simply how and when the unsustainability resolves itself. Economic collapses, historically, are not merely financial events. They are social events. They reshape political systems, empower demagogues, dissolve the trust that holds civil society together. The hyperinflation of Weimar Germany did not merely wipe out savings. It created the conditions in which something previously unthinkable became thinkable. For those who believe that the end-time scenario described in prophetic literature requires a certain kind of social and political destabilization before it can fully take shape, economic collapse has always been understood as one of the most plausible pathways toward that destabilization. And it is precisely in the context of economic vulnerability that the concern about control becomes most tangible. We noted in an earlier segment the verse in Revelation describing a system in which no one can buy or sell without a mark of compliance. That description has been debated and interpreted for 2,000 years. But what has changed in our generation is not the interpretation. It is the infrastructure. For the first time in history, the technical capability to implement a system of economic inclusion and exclusion at the individual level, in real time, across national borders, with automatic enforcement, actually exists. The digital payment systems, the central bank digital currencies in development, the biometric identity infrastructure, the AI systems capable of monitoring compliance at population scale. Each piece, taken alone, is unremarkable. Together, they form something that previous generations could only imagine. The question that prophecy watchers ask is not whether anyone is currently planning to implement such a system. The question is simply whether the infrastructure is in place, whether the architecture has been built. And the honest answer, increasingly, is that it largely has been. Not activated, not deployed in that way, but present, waiting. Into this landscape of economic uncertainty has come an idea that would have seemed radical not long ago but is now the subject of serious policy discussion in multiple countries. Universal basic income, the concept of providing every citizen with a regular, unconditional cash payment, regardless of employment status, as a floor beneath which no one can fall. Pilot programs have been run in Finland, in Kenya, in various cities across the United States, in Canada, and elsewhere. The results have been studied carefully. The debate about whether such a system is economically viable, socially desirable, or politically achievable continues. But the fact that it is being seriously discussed at all reflects something real about the direction of the underlying economy. Universal basic income is, at its root, a response to a perceived problem. The possibility that the economy is moving toward a state in which traditional employment can no longer provide a sufficient livelihood for a sufficient number of people. Which brings us to the force driving that possibility. Automation has been displacing human labor for as long as machines have existed. The Industrial Revolution replaced agricultural and craft labor. The computing revolution replaced clerical and administrative labor. Each wave of displacement was, eventually, followed by the creation of new categories of employment that absorbed the workers who had been displaced. The question being asked now, with genuine uncertainty, is whether artificial intelligence represents a displacement of a qualitatively different kind. Previous automation replaced human muscle, and eventually human routine. Artificial intelligence is beginning to replace human cognition, the ability to analyze, to write, to diagnose, to design, to decide. The categories of work that were previously considered safe because they required genuinely human intelligence are increasingly within reach of AI systems. If that displacement proceeds faster than new categories of employment can be created, and there is real debate among economists about whether new categories will emerge at all or whether this wave is different, then the social consequences would be significant. A large population without meaningful economic participation, dependent on some form of state support, is a population whose relationship to economic systems is fundamentally changed. A population, perhaps, more susceptible to the kind of compliance for access arrangements that prophetic literature describes. Food is where all of this becomes most visceral. Because whatever happens to currencies and employment and digital payment systems, the most fundamental economic leverage one entity can hold over another is control over food. The global food supply has become, over the past century, extraordinarily concentrated and extraordinarily complex. A relatively small number of companies control the majority of the world's seed supply. A similarly small number dominate fertilizer production, agricultural chemicals, and food processing. The supply chains through which food moves from field to table are long, intricate, and vulnerable to disruption in ways that became uncomfortably visible during the pandemic, when empty supermarket shelves appeared in some of the wealthiest countries on Earth. Climate stress is adding pressure to agricultural systems in ways that are difficult to predict with precision but easy to observe in aggregate. Droughts in breadbasket regions. Flooding of low-lying agricultural land. The slow salinization of coastal farmland. These are not future projections. They are current, documented trends. The combination of supply chain fragility, agricultural concentration, and climate stress means that food security, once taken for granted in wealthy nations, has quietly become a genuine policy concern. And where food security is uncertain, economic leverage over populations follows almost automatically. The ancient famines described in prophetic literature, the black horse of revelation carrying its scales, its voice announcing the price of bread, have always resonated most deeply with people who knew what it was to be genuinely hungry. In a world where food systems are more fragile than they appear, that resonance is worth sitting with quietly. And presiding over all of it, over the debt and the automation and the food systems and the payment infrastructure, are entities of a scale that would have been almost unimaginable to previous generations. The largest corporations in the world today are not merely large businesses. They are economic ecosystems. A single technology company can have a market capitalization larger than the gross domestic product of most nations. A handful of asset management firms collectively hold ownership stakes across the majority of the world's publicly traded companies. The supply chains, the data systems, the payment platforms, the cloud infrastructure on which the modern economy runs, all of it concentrated in the hands of a remarkably small number of organizations. These entities operate across national borders, beyond the effective regulatory reach of any single government, with resources sufficient to shape policy, fund research, influence media, and in some cases provide services that governments themselves can no longer afford to provide. They are not governments. They do not have citizens. But they have something that in many ways matters more: they have access. Access to the infrastructure of daily economic life. Access that can, in principle, be granted or withheld. For those reading the prophetic texts, the picture of a future economic authority with the power to include or exclude individuals from economic participation looks less like a single terrifying government and more like the quiet, incremental concentration of that kind of access into fewer and fewer hands over a very long period of time. It's a picture that is worth holding gently, without letting it disturb the rest that your body needs. Because here is what is also true. Ordinary human life, the making of meals, the raising of children, the kindness between neighbors, the small daily acts of generosity and courage and love, has always gone on inside whatever economic system surrounded it. People have found meaning and connection and goodness in the middle of Weimar inflation and medieval famine and every other economic disruption that history has produced. The systems change. The human things endure. So let the weight of the world's economy do its complicated thing out there, beyond the walls of wherever you are. Let the debt accrue and the algorithms run and the corporations consolidate. None of it needs your attention tonight. What needs your attention tonight is simply this: the breath moving in and out, the body growing heavier, the thoughts softening at their edges. We've been moving through the outer architecture of the world. The economic systems, the surveillance infrastructure, the technologies reshaping what it means to be human. Large, structural things. Things you can measure and chart and point to. But there is another layer to the prophetic picture. A more interior layer. One that has less to do with systems and institutions and more to do with the texture of daily life. The quality of the culture. The moral and spiritual atmosphere that ordinary people breathe in and breathe out every day without necessarily noticing it. The Apostle Paul, writing to his young companion Timothy somewhere around the middle of the 1st century, described what he called the last days in terms that were strikingly personal. Not geopolitical. Not technological. Just human. A list of qualities that he said would characterize people in that time. Lovers of self. Lovers of money. Boastful. Proud. Abusive. Disobedient to parents. Ungrateful. Unholy. Without love. Unforgiving. Slanderous. Without self-control. Brutal. Not lovers of good. Treacherous. Rash. Conceited. He called it, simply, perilous times. Readers in almost every generation since have looked at that list and recognized their own moment in it, which is itself worth noting. But tonight, we'll walk through some of the specific ways in which people today see those ancient words reflected in the world around them. The family, in virtually every human civilization across recorded history, has been the basic unit of social organization. Not merely a personal arrangement between individuals, but the foundational structure through which children are raised, values are transmitted, communities are formed, and the continuity of culture is maintained from one generation to the next. The changes to that structure across the past half-century have been significant and measurable. Marriage rates in most Western nations have been declining steadily for decades. Divorce rates rose sharply in the latter half of the 20th century and, while they have stabilized somewhat, remain high by historical standards. The proportion of children born outside of marriage has risen dramatically across most developed nations. Single-parent households, once relatively rare, now represent a substantial share of family structures in many countries. None of this is simple. The causes are multiple and genuinely debated. Economic pressures, shifting cultural expectations, changing legal frameworks, the rising independence of women, the declining social stigma around non-traditional arrangements, all of these things have played a role. And within those changed structures, millions of people are living with love, commitment, and genuine care for one another and for their children. But for those reading through a prophetic lens, the broad directional shift, away from the stable, multi-generational family structure that most of human civilization has treated as foundational, registers as significant. As one of the structural changes that, when a culture undergoes it at scale, tends to produce downstream effects that ripple through everything else. Running alongside the changes in family structure is something that operates at a more philosophical level. A shift in how truth itself is understood. For most of Western history, even among people who disagreed sharply about specific moral and religious questions, there was a broad shared assumption that truth existed. That some things were genuinely right and some things were genuinely wrong. That the purpose of moral reasoning was to try to get closer to what was actually true, not merely to negotiate a comfortable arrangement between competing preferences. That assumption has been eroding for several decades. The philosophical movement sometimes called postmodernism, which began in academic circles and has gradually permeated popular culture, holds that truth is not discovered but constructed. That moral frameworks are not reflections of an objective reality but expressions of cultural power. That the claim to speak truth is itself a form of authority to be questioned and resisted. In its popular form, this has become something like a default assumption for a significant portion of the population, particularly younger generations. The idea that one's moral convictions are personal, subjective, not to be imposed on others, not legitimately subject to external judgment, this is now so widely held that it barely feels like a philosophical position at all. It simply feels like common sense. For those reading the prophetic texts, this resonates with something Paul wrote in his second letter to Timothy about a time when people would not tolerate sound doctrine but would instead accumulate teachers who would say what their itching ears wanted to hear. A culture that has decided in advance that no one can tell it what is true is a culture that has, in a precise sense, made itself proof against the kind of authority that prophetic tradition claims to represent. In many societies around the world, the raw statistics on violence and lawlessness tell a complicated story. In some respects, by some measures, in some places, rates of certain kinds of violent crime have declined from their peaks in the late 20th century. That is worth acknowledging honestly. But in other respects, and by other measures, the picture is less reassuring. Political violence has been rising in many democracies. Mass casualty attacks, of various kinds, have become a feature of life in societies that once considered themselves largely immune to them. Civil unrest, in forms ranging from protest to riot to organized criminal activity operating in the open, has become more visible in cities across the developed world. And beneath the headline statistics, there is a quality to public life in many places, a coarseness, an aggression, a willingness to treat other human beings with contempt that people who pay attention to the atmosphere of culture find harder to dismiss than any single data point. The Olivet Discourse, where we began this whole journey, includes a phrase that is easy to pass over but worth sitting with. Jesus said that in the last days, because lawlessness would increase, the love of many would grow cold. Not just that behavior would worsen, but that the moral and emotional coldness of a culture would follow from its lawlessness. That there is a connection between what a society permits and what its people feel for one another. That connection feels, to many observers, uncomfortably visible in the present moment. There is another development that professor-minded Christians note with particular attention, because it touches their own community most directly. Growing hostility toward Christianity in societies that were, not long ago, broadly sympathetic or at least tolerant toward it. This takes different forms in different places. In some parts of the world, it is severe and physical. The persecution of Christian minorities in the Middle East, in parts of Africa and Asia, has been documented extensively and is, by any reasonable measure, one of the significant humanitarian stories of our time. Hundreds of thousands of Christians displaced, imprisoned, or killed for their faith in a variety of countries in a relatively short span of years. In the West, the hostility takes softer but still significant forms. Legal challenges to religious exemptions. The increasing treatment of traditional Christian moral positions not as views to be debated but as forms of bigotry to be suppressed. The quiet disappearance of Christian expression from public life in institutions and spaces where it was once simply part of the cultural air. A shift in the social cost of open Christian belief, particularly among younger and more educated populations. Jesus, in the Olivet Discourse, told his disciples that they would be hated by all nations on account of his name. Paul told Timothy that all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. For those living inside the Christian tradition, the experience of increasing social and cultural hostility is not primarily a political grievance. It is a confirmation of something they were told to expect. Perhaps more unsettling to many within the church than pressure from outside, it is what they observe happening inside it. The phenomenon that theologians call apostasy, a turning away from, or abandonment of, previously held faith, has been a feature of religious life since the beginning. But in recent decades, something beyond ordinary individual drift has been visible. Prominent voices within Christian institutions, pastors, theologians, authors, teachers who built their reputations within the evangelical or broader Christian world, have publicly abandoned central tenets of the faith they once taught. Not quietly slipping away but loudly departing, often with explanations that repudiate what they previously claimed to believe. At the same time, some Christian denominations have been engaged in protracted and sometimes bitter internal debates about whether long-standing moral teachings of the Church require revision in light of contemporary cultural values. Those debates have, in several cases, resulted in formal splits, institutional divisions that have separated communities of worship that shared centuries of common history. Paul's letter to Timothy warned specifically about a time when some would depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits. His second letter warned about people having a form of godliness but denying its power. For those who hold traditional Christian belief, watching these dynamics unfold within institutions they love is a source of grief that sits somewhat apart from purely prophetic analysis. And woven through all of this is a generational shift that is measurable in survey data across virtually every Western nation. Each successive generation, by the numbers, is less religiously affiliated, less likely to hold traditional religious beliefs, less likely to attend religious services, and more likely to identify with no religious tradition at all than the generation before it. The category researchers call knowns, people who identify with no religion when asked, has been growing steadily and is now the largest single religious demographic in several countries. Among younger generations, the departure from institutional religious life has been particularly pronounced. The reasons are multiple and debated. Institutional scandals have played a role. Cultural shifts in how authority is perceived have played a role. The fragmentation of community life and the rise of digital alternatives to in-person gathering have played a role. What is clear is that the religious landscape of the West looks meaningfully different than it did a generation ago, and the trajectory of change shows no signs of reversing. The world that produced the great missionary movements, the great revival movements, the cultural assumption that Christianity was the default framework of Western civilization, that world is receding. What replaces it is still being formed. For prophetic thinkers, this is not merely a sociological observation. It is the fulfillment of a trajectory that the texts described. A faith that began as a mustard seed was always going to have its season of apparent diminishment before whatever comes next. And yet, within all of this, within the institutional decline and the cultural hostility and the internal divisions and the generational drift, there are also, quietly, signs of something else. Communities of genuine faith forming outside traditional structures. Young people finding their way to ancient beliefs by unexpected routes. Revivals breaking out in places where no one planned them and no one predicted them. The prophetic tradition has never been a simple story of uninterrupted decline. It is a more complicated story than that. One that moves through darkness toward something. And now, having looked, you can set it down. All of it. The cultural shifts and the generational changes and the institutional tremors. You can set it all down the way you set down something heavy at the end of a long walk. Your body knows how to rest. Your mind can follow. We ended our last segment with something honest. An acknowledgement that the religious landscape of the Western world is shifting. That institutional Christianity is declining by the numbers. That each successive generation is less connected to the faith traditions that shaped Western civilization for more than 1,000 years. But here is what that picture leaves out. The fact that people are leaving traditional religious structures does not mean that people are becoming less spiritual. In many cases, quite the opposite is true. What is happening, in much of the Western world and beyond, is not a movement from belief to unbelief. It is a movement from one kind of belief to another. From structured, historically rooted, doctrinally defined faith toward something more fluid, more personal, more eclectic, more difficult to name. And it is precisely here, in this shifting spiritual landscape, that the prophetic tradition has some of its most specific and most striking things to say. Jesus, in the Olivet Discourse where our journey began, returned more than once to a single warning. Not about wars, not about earthquakes, not about economic systems or political power. The warning he repeated, with particular emphasis, was about deception. Watch out that no one deceives you, he said. False messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. It is a warning that presupposes something important. That in the last days, the deception will not be crude or obviously false. It will be sophisticated. It will be accompanied by genuine signs. It will be compelling enough to mislead people who consider themselves discerning. The warning is not primarily about people who abandon spirituality altogether. It is about people who remain intensely, earnestly spiritual, but orient that spirituality toward the wrong thing. With that warning in mind, let's look at what is happening in the spiritual landscape of our time. Across the past several decades, a loose and enormously diverse movement has been reshaping the spiritual lives of millions of people in ways that rarely make headline news but are visible everywhere once you start looking for them. It goes by many names. New Age spirituality, neo-paganism, spiritual but not religious, the wellness movement, in some of its more explicitly spiritual expressions. What these varied streams share is a set of common assumptions. That the divine is accessible through personal experience rather than institutional mediation. That ancient wisdom traditions from across the world can be freely combined and adapted to individual need. That the self is, at some level, divine. That spiritual reality is plural and personal and ultimately defined by the individual seeker rather than received from any external authority. The growth of this broad spiritual movement has been extraordinary. It draws from Hinduism and Buddhism, from indigenous traditions, from Gnostic Christianity, from astrology and divination, from depth psychology, from psychedelic experience, from shamanic practice. It is enormously creative, enormously appealing, and almost entirely without doctrinal structure or accountability. For the prophetic tradition, which has always insisted that not all spiritual experience is trustworthy, not all spiritual power is benign, and not all paths lead to the same destination, this explosion of eclectic spirituality is exactly the kind of landscape in which the deception that Jesus warned about could most easily flourish. A culture that has decided that all spiritual paths are equally valid is a culture that has, almost by definition, disabled its ability to evaluate them. Some of that deception, the prophetic tradition would suggest, comes packaged in remarkably attractive and influential forms. We live in an era of unprecedented celebrity influence. Platforms that allow individual voices to reach tens or hundreds of millions of people have created a new kind of spiritual authority. One based not on institutional ordination or theological training or demonstrated holiness, but on charisma, visibility, and the capacity to make people feel seen and understood. Celebrity-driven spiritual movements have become a significant feature of the contemporary landscape. Figures from the worlds of entertainment, wellness, self-help, and social media regularly share spiritual frameworks with audiences of millions. Frameworks that blend therapeutic language with spiritual concepts, that promise transformation and meaning and connection, that feel profound and personally resonant but often lack any accountability structure, any doctrinal grounding, any mechanism for correction. The history of religion is full of charismatic figures who gathered devoted followings and led them somewhere unexpected. The prophetic tradition is acutely aware of this pattern, which is why it returns so insistently to the warning about false prophets who come in sheep's clothing but are inwardly something else. The clothing changes with each generation. The pattern does not. Something else has been shifting in the cultural atmosphere, quietly but unmistakably. The occult, a category that includes practices like divination, astrology, witchcraft, ritual magic, and communication with non-human entities, has moved, in the space of roughly 2 decades, from the fringes of culture to something approaching the mainstream. Astrology, once the province of supermarket tabloids and specialty bookshops, is now a daily feature of the social media lives of millions of young people. The language of signs and houses and retrogrades has become a common conversational currency among people who would never describe themselves as occultists. Tarot cards, Ouija boards, and crystals are stocked in major retail chains. Television, film, and streaming media have produced a steady stream of content that presents witchcraft, demonology, and occult ritual in aesthetically appealing, sympathetically framed ways. This normalization has happened gradually enough that it barely registered as a cultural shift while it was occurring. But from the vantage point of the prophetic tradition, which draws a sharp distinction between the spiritual practices it endorses and the ones it warns against, the degree to which occult practice and symbolism has been absorbed into mainstream entertainment and daily life represents a significant change in the spiritual atmosphere of the culture. Into this already complex landscape has come a phenomenon that has, in recent years, moved from the edge of public discourse to something approaching official acknowledgement. The question of unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs, or in older terminology, UFOs. For decades, discussion of unexplained aerial phenomena was largely confined to enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists, easily dismissed by mainstream institutions. That began to change noticeably in the late 2010s, when the United States government released authenticated military footage of aerial objects displaying flight characteristics that seemed to exceed the capabilities of any known human technology. Congressional hearings followed. Official investigation programs were established. Credible voices, military pilots, intelligence officials, scientists, began speaking publicly about experiences and observations that they found genuinely unexplainable. The phenomenon itself remains deeply mysterious. What these objects are, where they come from, and what their presence means are questions that have not been answered. The range of proposed explanations runs from advanced foreign technology to atmospheric phenomena to something stranger and harder to categorize. For those reading through a prophetic lens, the particular concern is not the physical reality of unusual aerial phenomena. It is the interpretive framework being constructed around them. A significant cultural narrative has been building, through books, documentaries, congressional testimony, and social media, that frames at least some of these phenomena in terms of non-human intelligence with a long-standing interest in humanity. Some of that narrative explicitly draws on religious and spiritual language. Contact. Disclosure. Beings who have been guiding human development. Ancient interactions encoded in religious traditions. The prophetic tradition is not silent on the subject of non-human intelligent entities with an interest in humanity and a capacity for deception. Whatever one makes of the UAP phenomenon itself, the interpretive structure being built around it, the spiritually inflected narrative of contact and guidance from non-human beings, fits with precision into the category of end-time deception that the texts describe. A deception accompanied by genuine signs. A deception with a supernatural or apparently supernatural character. A deception capable of offering answers to the deepest human questions about origin and meaning and contact with the divine. And now, layered on top of all of this, comes technology. Because the line between genuine spiritual deception and technologically manufactured spectacle is becoming, in our time, very difficult to locate. Holographic projection technology has advanced to the point where large-scale, photorealistic three-dimensional images can be projected into open-air spaces and viewed by large numbers of people simultaneously. Immersive reality systems, augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, are becoming more convincing and more accessible with each passing year. The same deepfake technology we discussed in our segment on artificial intelligence that can put fabricated words in the mouths of world leaders can, in principle, manufacture visual and auditory experiences of an apparently miraculous character. Some researchers and technology commentators have noted, with varying degrees of seriousness, that the technology to stage a convincing mass deception, an event that appeared, to millions of observers, to be supernatural in character, is approaching practical viability. The specific mechanisms are less important than the general principle. We are entering an era in which the difference between something genuinely supernatural and something technologically manufactured may be, for an ordinary observer in the moment, indistinguishable. For a tradition whose founder warned that false signs and wonders would be the primary tool of end-time deception, and whose scriptures describe a figure with the power to perform those signs convincingly enough to mislead almost everyone, the convergence of advanced deception technology with a spiritually untethered and credulous cultural moment is something worth noting. Something worth holding in quiet, careful attention. It is a lot to sit with. A landscape in which genuine spiritual hunger is being met by 1,000 streams of uncertain origin, in which the ancient warnings about deception feel less like abstract theology and more like a description of the present cultural moment. But here is also what is true. The same tradition that warns most urgently about deception is also the one that speaks most confidently about the possibility of genuine discernment, of a wisdom that can, quietly and without drama, tell the difference between the real and the counterfeit, not through suspicion or fear, but through a deep familiarity with what is true. That kind of discernment doesn't require anxiety. It requires rootedness, stillness, the kind of quiet interior knowing that is, interestingly enough, most accessible precisely when the noise of the world has been turned down, which is where you are right now. We've been moving through the spiritual landscape of our time. The eclectic movements and celebrity prophets and occult currents quietly reshaping the interior life of the culture. And underneath all of that, the ancient warning about deception, about a time when the counterfeits would be good enough to fool almost everyone. But there is another kind of signal worth paying attention to. Not theological, not geopolitical, something more diffuse, more atmospheric. The kind of signal that a culture sends not through its institutions or its politics but through its stories, through what it chooses to imagine, through the fears and the longings it keeps returning to again and again, in the narratives it tells itself in the dark. Because cultures, like individuals, reveal something important in what they dream about. And what the culture of our time keeps dreaming about is striking. Look at the landscape of popular entertainment across the past 2 or 3 decades, and a pattern emerges that is difficult to ignore. The apocalypse has become, in some ways, the dominant imaginative framework of our era. Post-apocalyptic fiction, stories set in the aftermath of civilization's collapse, has become one of the most commercially successful and culturally resonant genres in film, television, and literature. Dystopian narratives, in which the world has been reshaped by some catastrophic or authoritarian transformation, have moved from the literary margins to the center of mainstream culture. The hunger for stories about the end of the world, or the world after the end, appears to be essentially inexhaustible. This is not entirely new. Literature and film have engaged with apocalyptic themes throughout the 20th century, often in direct response to the existential fears of their moment: nuclear annihilation, totalitarianism, environmental catastrophe. But what feels different about the current moment is both the sheer volume of this kind of storytelling and its tone. Earlier apocalyptic narratives often carried within them a warning, a plea: see what we are heading toward, and choose differently. Much of contemporary apocalyptic fiction carries something quieter and more resigned. Not a warning but an assumption. Not if, but when. Not a future to be avoided but a landscape to be navigated. A culture that has shifted from warning about the end to simply assuming it, and focusing its imaginative energy on what comes after, has moved somewhere new in its collective psychology. For those reading through a prophetic lens, A culture rehearsing the end of the world in its stories is a culture doing something more than entertaining itself. It is processing a premonition. And the premonition is not confined to fiction. It shows up in surveys, in social research, in the reported inner lives of ordinary people across a remarkable range of backgrounds and belief systems. Poll after poll, across different countries and different demographics, finds a significant and growing proportion of people who report a sense that the world is approaching some kind of major turning point. Not necessarily a religious end times. Not necessarily the specific scenarios described in prophetic literature. Just a felt sense, difficult to articulate precisely, that the current arrangement of things cannot continue indefinitely. That something significant is coming. That the world recognizable from childhood is in the process of becoming something else. This intuition cuts across lines of faith and politics and culture in ways that make it difficult to attribute to any single cause. Religious conservatives feel it. Secular progressives feel it. Scientists and artists and farmers and schoolteachers feel it. People who have never read a word of prophetic scripture and people who have read nothing else. There is something in the atmosphere of this particular moment in history that a very large number of people are registering, independently and through very different frameworks, as significant. The prophetic tradition has a name for that kind of widespread, cross-cultural intuition. It calls it the creation groaning. Paul wrote in his letter to the Romans about the whole creation groaning as in the pains of childbirth, waiting for something to be revealed. A world in labor. Sensing the approach of something it cannot yet see clearly but can no longer pretend is not coming. That sense of approaching transformation is not merely philosophical. It is showing up in the bodies and minds of people in ways that are measurable, clinical, and deeply concerning. Mental health crises have been rising across the developed world for years, accelerating sharply in the wake of the pandemic. Depression, anxiety, loneliness, burnout. These are not niche concerns affecting a small vulnerable minority. They have become defining features of life for enormous numbers of people across all age groups. The World Health Organization has described the global mental health situation in terms that suggest something systemic rather than merely individual. Something in the structure of modern life itself that is generating psychological distress at a scale that individual treatment, however good, cannot fully address. Burnout. That particular exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion but from sustained effort in the absence of meaning, has become one of the signature conditions of our era. It affects professionals in demanding careers. It affects caregivers. It affects parents. It affects young people before they have even fully entered adult life. There is a quality of depletion to the present moment that goes beyond ordinary tiredness. A sense that the demands of modern life are drawing on reserves that are not being replenished. For those paying prophetic attention, this collective exhaustion has a resonance in the texts. The description of the last days is not only one of external crisis and geopolitical upheaval. It includes a quality of interior weariness. Men's hearts failing them for fear, as Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse puts it, for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. A world whose inhabitants are not merely threatened but worn out, spent, running on diminishing reserves of hope. Nowhere is that depletion more visible and more troubling to those who think about the long-term health of societies than among the young. Youth disillusionment with institutions has been building for decades and has now reached levels that researchers describe with barely concealed alarm. Trust in government, in media, in educational institutions, in religious bodies, in corporations, in the legal system. Across virtually every category of institutional life, the confidence of younger generations has fallen to historic lows. And unlike previous periods of youthful skepticism, which often gave way to a gradual re-engagement with institutions as people settled into adult life, the current disillusionment appears to be deeper and more durable. This is not simply cynicism. It is, in many cases, a rational response to genuine institutional failure. The financial crisis of 2008 devastated the economic prospects of a generation that had been promised that following the prescribed path would lead to stability. Institutional scandals, in the church, in government, in media, in entertainment, have been revealed with a frequency and a severity that makes simple trust feel naive. The gap between what institutions claim to represent and what they demonstrably do has been visible, in high definition, to a generation that grew up with the tools to see it clearly and the platforms to say so. The result is a generation navigating adult life with less of the institutional scaffolding that previous generations could rely on. Less faith in the structures that are supposed to organize meaning, provide security, and transmit values. Building their identities and their lives in a landscape of institutional rubble, often with remarkable creativity and resilience, but also with a fragility that the absence of rootedness tends to produce. And threading through all of this, in ways that are subtle but significant, is a change in how people relate to language, to sustained thought, to the kind of deep reading and careful reasoning that complex ideas require. Literacy, not merely the ability to decode written words, but the capacity to engage with long-form argument, to follow an extended chain of reasoning, to sit with complexity and ambiguity without immediately reaching for a resolution, has been under pressure for years. Reading rates have declined. The ability to sustain attention on a single subject for an extended period has been measurably affected by the design of digital media, which is engineered, with considerable sophistication, to keep attention moving rather than settling. Public discourse has shortened and flattened. The nuanced, paragraph-length argument has given way to the slogan, the headline, the caption, the comment. Political and moral positions that once required extended reasoning to articulate are now expressed in forms that fit on a bumper sticker. The result is a public conversation in which the most complex and consequential questions of the age are being debated with tools increasingly ill-suited to their complexity. For the prophetic tradition, which depends on the ability of people to read carefully, reason slowly, and hold difficult ideas in sustained attention, this shift in the cognitive habits of the culture is not merely an educational concern. It is a spiritual one. A culture that has lost the capacity for deep reading has also, in some measure, lost the capacity for the kind of encounter with ancient text that has always been the primary means by which the prophetic tradition transmits itself from generation to generation. Taken together, these cultural signals paint a picture of a world that knows, in its bones, that something is happening. That is rehearsing endings in its stories. That is wearing out under the weight of a present that feels increasingly unstable. That has lost confidence in the structures that once organized its life. That is processing its unease in fragments, in scrolls, in 30-second clips, because it has largely lost the tools for the longer, slower kind of reflection that the moment might actually require. It is, in its way, a picture of a world that has forgotten how to be still. Which makes what you are doing right now, in this quiet, in this unhurried darkness, something a little more countercultural than it might appear. You are being still. You are letting thoughts move slowly. You are practicing the ancient art of simply resting in the present moment without needing to resolve it or fix it or scroll past it. That is enough. That is, in its quiet way, a kind of resistance. We've been sitting with the interior landscape of our time. The apocalyptic imagination saturating the culture's stories. The collective sense of approaching transformation that cuts across belief systems and demographics. The mental exhaustion of a world running on diminishing reserves. The shortened attention and the institutional distrust of a generation navigating adult life without the scaffolding that previous generations relied upon. And now we step outside. Away from the human systems and the human psychology, and into the natural world itself. The ground beneath our feet. The sky above. The oceans that cover most of the planet's surface. The sun that makes all of it possible. Because the prophetic tradition does not limit its signs to the human realm. It speaks of the creation itself participating in the events of the last days. Not merely as a backdrop. As an active element of the story. Jesus, in the Olivet Discourse, mentioned earthquakes in various places, and famines, alongside the human signs of war and persecution. The Book of Revelation describes, in its sequence of judgments, events that read remarkably like natural catastrophes. Waters becoming undrinkable, the sun scorching with intense heat, darkness falling, islands and mountains being moved. Whether these are understood literally or symbolically, the tradition is clear that the natural world will not remain a passive bystander. With that in mind, let's walk slowly through what the natural world has been doing. The frequency and intensity of natural disasters has been a subject of intense scientific study and genuine public concern for several decades now. The data, depending on how it is measured and interpreted, tells a complicated story. Some categories of extreme events have become measurably more frequent. Others are more intense when they occur, even if not necessarily more frequent. And the economic and human costs of natural disasters have risen sharply, partly because of changes in the events themselves and partly because more people are living in vulnerable places than ever before. What is not disputed is that the world's attention is being captured by natural disasters with a regularity that feels different from previous eras. Devastating floods in regions that rarely experienced them. Wildfires of a scale and intensity that overwhelmed the communities and the firefighting systems designed to manage them. Hurricanes making landfall with a ferocity that broke historical records. Prolonged droughts turning previously productive agricultural regions into dust. For those reading through a prophetic lens, the acceleration of natural disasters does not require a single dramatic apocalyptic event to be significant. It is the pattern that matters. The escalating frequency. The sense that the natural world is moving through a period of increasing instability. The Olivet Discourse described these events as the beginning of birth pains, not the end itself, but the early contractions of something larger approaching. Agriculture sits at the intersection of the natural and the human, and it is there that the consequences of environmental instability become most immediately and viscerally felt. The world's food systems depend on a degree of climatic predictability that has, for most of recorded history, been largely reliable. Planting and harvest cycles, water availability, the behavior of pollinators, the absence of catastrophic pest outbreaks, all of these things have been calibrated over generations to the rhythms of a relatively stable climate. And those rhythms are changing. Prolonged droughts have stressed grain production in some of the world's most important agricultural regions. Unseasonal frosts have destroyed crops after farmers have already planted in expectation of normal conditions. Flooding has inundated low-lying farmland at critical points in the growing season. The behavior of the monsoon systems that billions of people in South and Southeast Asia depend on for their water supply has become less predictable. None of this means global famine is imminent. The world's agricultural systems are resilient and adaptive, and human ingenuity has repeatedly found ways to maintain and expand food production in the face of environmental challenges. But the margin of that resilience is being tested in ways that agricultural scientists take seriously. A world in which food production is under sustained environmental pressure is a world in which the ancient image of the black horse carrying its scales begins to feel less distant. Beneath the surface of the Earth, the planet has its own rhythms. And in recent years, those rhythms have been capturing global attention in ways that are difficult to ignore. Earthquake activity has been a consistent feature of the news cycle, with significant seismic events occurring in populated regions with a frequency that keeps the subject present in public consciousness. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. The 2010 Haiti earthquake. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami that triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster. The repeated devastating earthquakes in Turkey, in Nepal, in Morocco, in Afghanistan. Each one a reminder that the surface of the Earth, which human civilization has built itself upon with such confidence and permanence, is not as fixed as it appears. Volcanic activity has similarly been drawing attention. The eruption of Tonga Harapai in January 2022 was described by scientists as one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions recorded in the modern era. It generated a pressure wave that circled the globe multiple times, a tsunami that crossed the Pacific, and an injection of water vapor into the stratosphere at a scale that researchers are still studying for its potential atmospheric effects. The Earth is not still. It never has been. But there is a quality to the current period of seismic and volcanic activity that researchers and observers describe as notable. And for those who remember that Jesus specifically cited earthquakes in various places as among the signs to watch for, each significant seismic event registers as something more than a geological occurrence. The oceans cover more than 70% of the Earth's surface. They regulate the planet's temperature, produce a significant portion of its oxygen, and support food systems that billions of people depend upon. And the oceans are under stress in ways that are measurable, documented, and in some cases already crossing thresholds that marine scientists describe with genuine alarm. Coral reef systems, which support roughly a quarter of all marine species despite covering less than 1% of the ocean floor, have experienced repeated and increasingly severe bleaching events as ocean temperatures rise. The Great Barrier Reef, the largest coral reef system on Earth, has experienced multiple mass bleaching events in recent years of a severity that has no historical precedent. Marine biologists have documented large-scale die-offs of fish, sea mammals, and other marine life in various ocean regions, often connected to changes in water temperature, oxygen levels, or the chemistry of the water itself. The Book of Revelation describes, in its second trumpet judgment, something that sounds remarkably like a catastrophic marine event: a third of the sea becoming like blood, a third of sea creatures dying. Whatever the ultimate interpretation of that passage, the image of large-scale marine death resonates differently in an era when marine die-offs are documented news events rather than purely symbolic language. Above the Earth, the sun continues its ancient cycles. But those cycles carry consequences for the modern world that previous generations did not have to consider, because previous generations did not build a civilization so comprehensively dependent on electromagnetic infrastructure. Solar flares, eruptions of electromagnetic radiation from the sun's surface, and the associated coronal mass ejections that can hurl billions of tons of magnetized plasma toward Earth are a normal feature of solar activity. For most of human history, they were essentially harmless curiosities, occasionally producing spectacular auroral displays at high latitudes. In a world whose power grids, communication satellites, navigation systems, financial networks, and internet infrastructure all depend on uninterrupted electromagnetic stability, a sufficiently large solar event is a different kind of threat. The Carrington event of 1859, the largest solar storm in recorded history, induced currents strong enough to set telegraph equipment on fire and send sparks across telegraph offices across North America and Europe. Had that event occurred today, researchers estimate its effects on modern infrastructure would be catastrophic and potentially civilization disrupting. The Sun operates on cycles of approximately 11 years, moving between periods of lower and higher activity. In periods of solar maximum, the probability of significant flare events increases. Space weather scientists monitor solar activity continuously, with the awareness that a sufficiently large event could, with relatively little warning, plunge significant portions of the modern world into a darkness more comprehensive than anything its inhabitants have experienced. For a prophetic tradition that describes a time when the lights of the heavens are disrupted, the practical mechanisms by which that disruption could occur in our era are worth sitting with quietly. And then there is a threat that operates not in the sky or in the earth but at a scale invisible to the human eye. One that has been building quietly in the background of the global health conversation for decades, moving steadily closer to the foreground. Antibiotic resistance. The process by which bacteria evolve to defeat the drugs designed to kill them. The development of antibiotics in the 20th century was one of the most consequential achievements in human medical history. Infections that had routinely killed healthy people, pneumonia, tuberculosis, sepsis from wound infections, became treatable and survivable. Modern surgery, chemotherapy, organ transplantation, and countless other medical procedures became possible only because antibiotics could prevent the infections that would otherwise make them fatal. That protective layer is eroding. Decades of antibiotic use in human medicine and, more significantly, in industrial agriculture has accelerated the natural evolutionary process by which bacteria develop resistance. Strains of bacteria that are resistant to multiple antibiotics, or to virtually all available antibiotics, have been identified and are spreading. The World Health Organization has described antimicrobial resistance as one of the greatest threats to global health, food security, and development. Some researchers have warned that without serious intervention, the world could be moving toward a post-antibiotic era, one in which routine infections once again become potentially fatal. The prophetic image of pestilence, the pale horse of Revelation carrying death in its wake, has been applied across history to every great epidemic that preceded it. The Black Death, smallpox, the 1918 influenza pandemic. Each generation of prophecy watchers has seen in the great disease of their era the fulfillment of those ancient images. The particular character of the antibiotic resistance threat, slow-moving, largely invisible, the product of accumulated human decisions rather than a single dramatic outbreak, gives it a quality that is, in some ways, more unsettling than a sudden epidemic. It is a threshold that is being approached gradually, step by quiet step. The natural world is speaking. in earthquakes and storms and ocean changes and solar cycles and microscopic evolutionary processes that carry consequences of enormous scale. It is speaking in a language that does not require theological interpretation to be audible. Scientists are hearing it. Researchers are documenting it. Ordinary people, in their intuition that something is shifting in the fabric of the world around them, are feeling it. Whether one hears in that voice the birth pains of the Olivet Discourse, or simply the complex self-expression of a planet under pressure, the voice is real. The signals are there. But you do not need to interpret them tonight. You do not need to draw conclusions or make preparations or figure out what it all means. The natural world will do what it does whether you are awake or asleep. The earthquakes will occur on their own schedule, entirely indifferent to your wakefulness. So let them. Let the earth turn and the sun pulse and the oceans move in their great slow patterns. You are a small, warm, breathing thing in the middle of it all. And small, warm, breathing things need rest. We've been out in the natural world, listening to the earthquakes and the storms and the shifting oceans and the quiet biological threats building beneath the threshold of daily awareness. The creation doing its ancient, complicated work, indifferent to human schedules and human plans. And now we turn to something that is entirely human in its origin, even if its consequences have always had a way of exceeding anything its architects imagined. War. The organized application of violence at scale. The thing that has accompanied human civilization from its earliest recorded moments to its present one, changing in its methods and its weapons while remaining, in its essential nature, stubbornly unchanged. The prophetic tradition has always understood war as one of the primary signs of the last days. Not because war is new, it has never been absent from human history for long, but because of what the texts describe as its character and scale in the final season of history. Wars and rumors of wars. Nation rising against nation. Kingdom against kingdom. And ultimately, a gathering of the world's military powers toward a final confrontation in the Valley of Megiddo, a place whose very name has become synonymous, in every language that has borrowed the word, with apocalyptic conflict. Tonight, we walk through the military landscape of our time. Slowly, without alarm. Just noticing what has been built, and what it means that it exists. We begin with the weapon that changed everything. The one that introduced, for the first time in human history, the genuine possibility of civilizational self-destruction. The atomic bomb was detonated for the first time in the desert of New Mexico in July of 1945. 3 weeks later, 2 Japanese cities ceased to exist in the space of moments. And the world that emerged from that summer was permanently different from the one that had entered it. Not merely in its politics or its power structures, but in its self-understanding. For the first time, humanity held in its own hands the technical capacity to end itself. The nuclear arsenals that exist today are vastly larger and more sophisticated than the weapons of 1945. The United States and Russia between them hold thousands of nuclear warheads, many of them many times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Other nations, China, France, Britain, Pakistan, India, Israel, North Korea, maintain their own arsenals of varying size. The total destructive capacity distributed across these weapons is, by any reasonable calculation, sufficient to end organized human civilization multiple times over. For those reading prophetic literature, the arrival of nuclear weapons was a genuinely significant moment. For most of Christian history, the descriptions in Revelation of cities destroyed in an hour, of fire and smoke and sulfur consuming vast populations, of the mountains and islands being moved out of their places, required a kind of imaginative suspension of disbelief. After August 1945, they required rather less imagination than before. Into this already sobering landscape has come a development that has been receiving quiet but intense attention from military strategists and national security researchers for the past decade. Hypersonic weapons, missiles and glide vehicles capable of traveling at speeds of Mach 5 or above, roughly 5 times the speed of sound, are being developed and, in some cases, already deployed by multiple major powers. What makes hypersonic weapons strategically significant is not merely their speed, though that is remarkable enough. It is the combination of speed, maneuverability, and low flight altitude that makes them extraordinarily difficult to detect and intercept with existing defensive systems. A ballistic missile follows a predictable arc through space that can be tracked and, in principle, intercepted. A hypersonic glide vehicle traveling at high speed at lower altitudes, capable of maneuvering unpredictably throughout its flight, presents a defensive challenge that current systems were not designed to meet. The practical consequence is a compression of the time available for decision-making in a crisis. The warning times that nuclear-armed nations have historically relied upon to assess a threat, consult their leadership, and decide how to respond are shortened, in the hypersonic era, to minutes rather than the tens of minutes that ballistic trajectories allowed. The margin for miscalculation, for misread signals, for the kind of accidental escalation that the world narrowly avoided several times during the Cold War, becomes correspondingly smaller. In a world of nuclear-armed nations with hypersonic weapons, the phrase wars and rumors of wars carries a weight that would not have been imaginable to previous generations. Not all of the most consequential military developments of our era involve kinetic weapons. Some of the most significant conflicts being waged right now are invisible to the naked eye, conducted entirely within the digital infrastructure that modern civilization depends upon. Cyber warfare, the use of digital tools to attack, degrade, or destroy an adversary's systems and infrastructure, has moved from a theoretical concern to a documented, ongoing reality. Power grids have been targeted and disrupted. Water treatment facilities have been compromised. Financial systems have been penetrated. Healthcare networks have been held hostage. Industrial control systems have been sabotaged. The sophistication of state-sponsored cyber operations has reached a level where the boundary between peacetime competition and active conflict is genuinely difficult to locate. Nations are conducting operations against each other's critical infrastructure on a continuous basis, in a grey zone that does not look like war by traditional definitions but carries consequences that can be as severe as physical attacks. The particular vulnerability that cyber warfare exposes is the degree to which modern civilization has built its most essential functions on digital infrastructure that was designed for connectivity rather than security. The power that flows to hospitals. The water that flows to cities. The financial systems through which food is purchased and wages are paid. All of it dependent on networks that determined, well-resourced adversaries have demonstrated the ability to reach. For a prophetic tradition that describes catastrophic disruptions to the basic conditions of civilized life, the existence of weapons capable of producing those disruptions without a single physical explosion is worth quiet contemplation. The character of warfare itself is also changing in ways that raise questions that go beyond strategy and into something more fundamental. Questions about what it means to take life. About the relationship between decision and consequence. About what happens to the human moral weight of violence when it is increasingly administered by machines. Drone technology has transformed conflict across the past 2 decades. What began as a tool for surveillance became a tool for targeted strikes, and has continued to evolve into something more complex and more troubling. Drone swarms, large numbers of small, coordinated autonomous aerial vehicles capable of operating together to overwhelm defenses, conduct surveillance, and deliver payloads, have moved from research demonstrations to battlefield deployment. The next development, already underway in multiple research programs, is the application of artificial intelligence to autonomous weapons systems. Machines capable of identifying targets, making engagement decisions, and acting on those decisions without a human in the decision loop. The ethical, legal, and strategic implications of removing the human from the act of killing are being debated urgently by researchers, ethicists, and military lawyers who are acutely aware that the technology is developing faster than the frameworks designed to govern it. A world in which warfare is conducted, at least in part, by autonomous systems making life-and-death decisions at machine speed, without human deliberation or human conscience in the moment of action, is a world that has crossed a threshold that most previous generations would have found deeply alarming. The prophetic tradition has always understood that the horrors of war are, in part, intended to be comprehensible to the human beings who produce them. War conducted by machines, at scales and speeds beyond human participation, is something different in kind. And then, above all of it, the frontier that humanity spent most of the 20th century racing to reach has become the newest theater of military competition. Space, for the first decades of the space age, was governed by a broad if informal norm that treated it as a domain for exploration and scientific cooperation rather than conflict. That norm has been eroding steadily. Military satellites, for navigation, communication, reconnaissance, and early warning, have been a feature of the space environment for decades. What is newer is the active development of capabilities designed to target those satellites. Anti-satellite weapons have been tested by multiple nations, demonstrating the ability to destroy objects in orbit and generating debris fields that threaten the entire orbital environment. Military doctrines in several major powers now explicitly identify space as a warfighting domain. Dedicated space commands have been established within military structures. The competition to develop the ability to deny an adversary the use of space-based assets, the GPS signals that guide weapons, the communication satellites that coordinate forces, the reconnaissance systems that provide situational awareness, has become a central feature of great power military competition. A conflict that extended into space, degrading or destroying the satellite infrastructure that the modern world depends on for navigation, communication, and timing, would have consequences for civilian life far beyond any military objective. The darkness that such a conflict could produce, not metaphorical but literal, in the form of navigation systems that stop working, communication networks that go silent, financial systems that lose their synchronization, has a resonance with prophetic descriptions of celestial disruption that is worth noting gently. It is a sobering inventory. The weapons of mass destruction maintained in sufficient quantity to end civilization. The hypersonic delivery systems that compress decision time to the edge of the possible. The cyber capabilities targeting the infrastructure of daily life. The autonomous systems removing human conscience from the act of violence. The extension of military competition into the heavens themselves. And yet the world has lived with nuclear weapons for 80 years and has not used them in anger since 1945. Human beings, even in their most dangerous moments, have repeatedly found reasons to step back from the final edge. That, too, is part of the record. That, too, is worth acknowledging. The prophetic tradition does not call its readers to despair about the weapons that exist in the world. It calls them to a kind of clear-eyed awareness, combined with a trust that the final outcome of history is not determined by the arsenals of nations. That the story ends somewhere other than a valley of ash. That is not naivety. It is a different kind of knowledge. A knowledge that does not require you to solve the problem of nuclear proliferation or autonomous weapons or space militarization tonight, in the dark, in the quiet of your resting place. We've been sitting with heavy things. The weapons and the arsenals and the autonomous systems and the militarization of the heavens. The weight of what human ingenuity, turned toward destruction, has managed to build. And we acknowledged, honestly and without false comfort, that the world has so far found reasons not to use the worst of what it has made. That restraint is real. It matters. And now we step back from the acute and the dramatic, and toward something that operates at a slower, larger scale. Something that does not make the news in the way that missile tests and cyber attacks do, because it is not an event. It is a condition. A gradual, enormous reshaping of how human beings organize themselves on the surface of the earth. Urbanization. The long, quiet migration of humanity from the fields and the villages and the small towns into the cities. Into the vast, complex, extraordinary, and fragile organisms that we call megacities. And the equally vast infrastructure of connection, the rail lines and shipping corridors and trade networks that bind those cities to each other and to the global systems that sustain them. It is a story that has been unfolding for centuries, but that has accelerated in our generation to a pace that has no precedent in human history. And it is, in its quiet way, one of the most consequential changes in the human condition that the modern era has produced. For most of human history, the city was the exception. The overwhelming majority of human beings lived in rural settings, connected to the land, organized around the rhythms of agriculture, embedded in relatively small communities where everyone knew everyone else across multiple generations. The great cities of antiquity, Rome at its height, ancient Alexandria, the great cities of the Tang dynasty in China, were remarkable precisely because they were rare. Concentrations of population and power and culture that stood apart from the rural world that surrounded and sustained them. That inversion began in earnest with the Industrial Revolution, as populations moved toward the factories and the economic opportunities that cities offered. And it has been accelerating ever since. In 2007, for the first time in human history, the global urban population exceeded the global rural population. More than half of all human beings now live in cities. By the middle of this century, that proportion is projected to rise to roughly 2/3. And the cities themselves have grown to scales that earlier generations would have struggled to comprehend. Tokyo, the world's largest metropolitan area, is home to somewhere between 35 and 37 million people. A single city containing a population larger than most nations. Jakarta, Delhi, Shanghai, Dhaka, Cairo, Mumbai, cities of 10, 15, 20, 25 million people, each of them a civilization unto itself, each of them more populous than the majority of the world's countries. For those reading the prophetic literature, the image of Babylon in Revelation, that great city, clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, the city through whose commerce the merchants of the earth had grown rich, has always been understood as a symbol of concentrated urban power and wealth. Whatever Babylon ultimately represents in prophetic interpretation, the existence of cities of a scale and economic centrality that would make ancient Babylon look like a modest provincial town is a feature of our world that the ancient imagery maps onto in striking ways. These megacities do not exist in isolation. They are nodes in a network, points of concentration in a web of connection that spans the entire planet, moving goods and people and capital and information between them in volumes and at speeds that have no historical precedent. The infrastructure of that network has been one of the defining construction projects of the 21st century. China's Belt and Road Initiative, arguably the largest infrastructure development program in human history, has been building roads, railways, ports, and pipelines across Asia, Africa, Europe, and beyond, connecting economies that were previously linked only loosely, drawing them into a web of trade and debt and dependency centered on Beijing. Intercontinental rail networks are extending across Eurasia in ways that are redrawing the ancient trade corridors of the Silk Road in steel and concrete. Port expansions in strategic locations, in the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, the Mediterranean, the African coastline, are reshaping the geography of global commerce. Undersea cable networks carry the vast majority of the world's international internet traffic along routes that hug the ocean floor, largely invisible and largely unprotected, connecting the digital infrastructure of the global economy across the seams between continents. The scale of these infrastructure investments is almost impossible to fully comprehend. They represent a physical rewriting of the map, a new set of arteries through which the lifeblood of the global economy flows. And like all arteries, their most important quality is not their capacity when everything is working. It is their vulnerability when something goes wrong. Because here is the thing about the vast, interconnected, extraordinarily efficient global system that urbanization and infrastructure investment have built. It is optimized for normal conditions in ways that make it remarkably fragile under abnormal ones. The megacity is, in many respects, an engineering marvel of the first order. A system that delivers water, food, energy, waste removal, communication, transportation, and security to tens of millions of people simultaneously, day after day, in a mostly uninterrupted flow that its inhabitants take entirely for granted. The complexity of the logistics required to keep a city of 30 million people fed and watered and powered and connected is staggering. But that complexity is also a vulnerability. A modern megacity has roughly 3 days of food supply in its distribution system at any given time. Its water supply depends on pumping infrastructure that requires continuous electrical power. Its transportation systems, the networks through which food and medicine and fuel move, are calibrated to operate at near capacity under normal conditions, with little redundancy built in for disruption. A significant earthquake striking directly beneath a megacity, a prolonged power outage caused by a cyber attack or a solar event, a disruption to the supply chains that keep its distribution system stocked, any of these things, in a city of sufficient size and density, could produce humanitarian consequences of extraordinary scale in a remarkably short period of time. The prophetic literature describes a future in which the great city, the urban concentration that represents the apex of human civilization and human commercial achievement, falls. Suddenly, catastrophically. In a single hour, As Revelation puts it, its great wealth laid waste. For most of Christian history, the mechanism of such a sudden, total collapse was difficult to imagine. The cities of the ancient world, for all their sophistication, were robust enough in their simplicity to survive considerable disruption. The megacities of our era are sophisticated enough to be something else entirely. They are precisely the kind of systems whose extraordinary normal function depends on a web of dependencies that, if disrupted at the right points, could unravel with a speed that would astonish even those who understood, intellectually, that it was possible. And the concentration is not merely a concentration of people. It is a concentration of everything. Of wealth and economic activity. Of data and processing capacity. Of political and institutional power. Of cultural production. Of the infrastructure of daily life in its most essential forms. The world's major financial centers, New York, London, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Frankfurt. Between them host the exchanges, the clearinghouses, the banking infrastructure, and the data centers through which the overwhelming majority of global economic activity flows. Damage or disruption to those nodes would not merely inconvenience the cities that house them. It would propagate outward through the entire global system with the speed and thoroughness of a signal moving through a neural network. The world has built itself, in other words, into a shape that is extraordinarily efficient and extraordinarily concentrated. That concentration has produced, and continues to produce, extraordinary human flourishing in the cities that benefit from it. The quality of life available to ordinary urban dwellers in the great cities of the world today, in terms of healthcare and education and culture and economic opportunity, exceeds anything that was available to even the wealthiest individuals in previous centuries. But the same concentration that produces that flourishing also produces a fragility, a single-pointedness. A condition in which the fate of enormous numbers of people is bound up in the continued functioning of systems that are, for all their sophistication, ultimately as vulnerable as the infrastructure they run on and the supply chains they depend upon. There is something almost meditative about contemplating a megacity at night. 30 million people breathing, sleeping, dreaming, working, loving, worrying, hoping. A vast organism of almost incomprehensible complexity, humming along in the dark. The lights visible from space. The heat signature detectable from orbit. A human creation on a scale that no individual human being can fully hold in their mind. And somewhere inside that organism, water is moving through pipes. Food is moving through supply chains. Power is moving through grids. Information is moving through networks. All of it continuous, all of it invisible to the people it sustains, all of it dependent on the next piece being where it is supposed to be. It is, in its way, magnificent. And it is, in its way, an act of extraordinary collective faith. Faith that the systems will hold. Faith that the dependencies will remain intact. Faith that tomorrow will look more or less like today. That faith has been rewarded, on the whole, for a long time. The systems have held. The dependencies have remained more or less intact. The enormous, fragile, magnificent organism of the modern megacity has continued, day after day, to do what it does. Whether it will always do so is the question that prophetic thinkers hold quietly in the background of their reading of the ancient texts. Not with gleeful anticipation. Not with panic. Just with the sober attention of people who have read carefully enough to know that what human beings build, human beings can lose. And that the things built in our generation are built on a scale that makes the losing of them harder to imagine and harder to survive than anything previous generations had to contemplate. But you don't need to contemplate it tonight. The megacities will do their humming and their spinning without your participation or your concern. The supply chains will move their invisible freight through the dark hours while you rest. You are not responsible for holding any of it together. You never were. The world was here before you, running its vast complicated systems, and it will continue running them whether you are watching or not. What is yours tonight is simply this quiet. This breath. This gradual, merciful softening of the day's accumulated weight. Let it soften. Let the thoughts that have been moving through this long, interesting evening drift a little further from the center, a little closer to the edges where they will dissolve into sleep. We've been walking through the architecture of the modern world. The megacities and their fragilities. The trade corridors and the infrastructure networks binding everything together into a single, intricate, interdependent whole. And we ended that segment with a kind of peace. A reminder that the vast systems of the world do not require your personal supervision to keep running through the night. But before we turn toward the horizon of hope that is waiting in the segments ahead, there is one more landscape to walk through. One that sits not in the realm of technology or infrastructure or the natural world, but in the space between human beings themselves. In the quality of the relationships, the conversations, the shared life that binds societies together, or fails to. Because for all the external signs and systems we have been surveying, the prophetic tradition has always understood that the most revealing indicator of a civilization's condition is not what it builds but how its people treat each other. The temperature of the social atmosphere. Whether the bonds of community and shared humanity are holding, or whether they are quietly, steadily fraying. And tonight, we sit with some honest observations about that temperature in our time. Something has been visible in the streets of the world's cities for the past decade and a half that is worth paying attention to. A rising tide of public unrest. Of people gathering in large numbers to express something that has moved beyond ordinary political disagreement into something rawer and more urgent. The Arab Spring of 2010 and 2011 swept across North Africa and the Middle East with a speed that astonished observers. In city after city, populations that had been quiet for decades under authoritarian governance suddenly filled the squares and the boulevards and refused to leave. Some of those movements produced genuine political change. Others were met with repression. Most produced outcomes that were more complicated and less hopeful than the extraordinary energy of their beginning suggested. But the Arab Spring was not an isolated phenomenon. It was an early expression of something global. Protest movements of unusual scale and intensity have erupted in country after country in the years since. In Hong Kong, in Chile, in France, where the Yellow Vest movement paralyzed the country for months. In Belarus, in Myanmar, in Iran, in the United States, in Brazil. Across the developed and the developing world, in democracies and autocracies alike, populations have been taking to the streets in numbers and with a persistence that suggests something more than ordinary political grievance. What these movements share, beneath their very different local causes, is a common emotional temperature. A sense that the systems governing people's lives are not working for them. That the gap between what those systems promise and what they deliver has grown too large to accept quietly. That something needs to change, urgently, at a level deeper than any particular policy can reach. For those reading prophetically, the image of the nations in turmoil, of people groups restless and ungovernable, has a specific resonance. The Psalms describe the nations raging and the peoples plotting. Luke's account of the Olivet Discourse speaks of the distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea, and the waves roaring, people fainting with fear and foreboding of what is coming on the world. The emotional quality of that description, the perplexity, the fear, the sense of forces beyond anyone's control, maps with uncomfortable precision onto the atmosphere of the present moment. And if the unrest in the streets reflects a rising pressure beneath the surface of public life, the condition of political discourse reflects what happens when that pressure finds no adequate channel. Political polarization has been intensifying across nation after nation for 2 decades. In the United States, the sorting of the population into 2 increasingly distinct and mutually hostile political tribes, each with its own media ecosystem, its own set of accepted facts, its own moral vocabulary, its own geography, has reached levels that researchers describe as historically unprecedented in the post-war era. What was once a spectrum of opinion shading across a broad middle ground has compressed into 2 poles with a widening gulf between them. This pattern is not unique to America. Similar dynamics have been documented in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, in Brazil, in India, in Israel, in dozens of other nations. The specific fault lines differ. Here it is economic, there it is ethnic or religious or regional, but the underlying dynamic is consistent. Societies are sorting themselves into groups whose members agree with each other more intensely and disagree with the other side more bitterly than at any point in recent memory. The mechanisms driving this sorting are partly technological. The recommendation algorithms of social media platforms, designed to maximize engagement, have discovered that outrage is among the most engaging of human emotions. They have optimized relentlessly for its production. The result is an information environment in which people on different sides of political divides are not merely reaching different conclusions from the same information, but consuming entirely different information ecosystems and living, in some meaningful sense, in different constructed realities. For the prophetic tradition, which has always understood that a house divided against itself cannot stand, the degree of division visible in the societies of our time is not merely a political problem. It is a sign of civilizational vulnerability. A society that has lost the capacity for shared perception of reality is a society whose coherence is under a kind of stress that no policy prescription fully addresses. And the divisions are not softening. They are hardening. There is a quality to contemporary social division that goes beyond ordinary disagreement. In previous eras of political conflict, it was generally possible, even across sharp divisions, for people to maintain the basic perception of each other as fellow human beings with whom one happened to disagree. The disagreement could be fierce and the conflict genuine without the dehumanization of the opponent becoming total. That distinction is becoming harder to maintain. The language of contemporary political discourse, in many contexts, has shifted from the language of disagreement into the language of existential threat. The other side is not merely wrong but dangerous. Not merely misguided but malevolent. Not simply to be defeated in argument or at the ballot box but to be silenced, excluded, punished. The moral vocabulary of politics has become, in many quarters, apocalyptic in its own secular register. Each election a final battle. Each policy dispute a last stand. What this hardening produces, practically, is a loss of the social tissue that makes collective response to shared challenges possible. Societies facing crises, environmental, economic, epidemiological, security, require a degree of shared perception and collective will to mount effective responses. A society in which every proposed collective action is immediately filtered through the lens of tribal suspicion, in which the messenger's identity determines whether the message is heard at all, is a society whose capacity to respond to genuine crises has been quietly degraded. Which brings us to something that the prophetic tradition observes with a particular kind of sadness. The failure of disaster to produce what disaster has historically, at least sometimes, produced. Repentance. Reflection. A turning. Throughout history, great catastrophes have occasionally functioned as moments of collective reckoning. Periods when the ordinary distractions of daily life were stripped away and populations were confronted with questions about meaning, about mortality, about the fragility of what they had taken for granted. The Black Death produced, alongside its devastation, genuine religious revivals and profound spiritual searching. The great wars of the 20th century, for all their horror, generated movements of sincere moral reflection and institutional reform. The crises of the early 21st century have been significant. The attacks of September 11, 2001 produced, in their immediate aftermath, a brief and genuine moment of collective reflection in many societies. The global pandemic of 2020 confronted the entire world simultaneously with mortality, fragility, and the limits of human control. But in both cases, and in the various economic and natural disasters that have punctuated the years between them, the reflective moment has been remarkably brief. The appetite for genuine, sustained reckoning, for the kind of collective turning that religious traditions call repentance, has been shallow and easily displaced. The distractions have returned quickly. The divisions have reasserted themselves, often deepened rather than softened by the shared experience of crisis. The questions raised by catastrophe have been answered primarily with political argument rather than moral reflection. The Book of Revelation, in its account of the judgments that fall upon the world, notes with a kind of sorrowful repetition that the people did not repent. The phrase recurs, cycle after cycle of judgment, like a tolling bell. The disasters come, and the disasters pass, and the fundamental orientation of the culture remains unchanged. It is one of the most quietly devastating observations in the prophetic literature. Not that judgment comes, but that it comes, and the heart does not turn. There is no triumphalism in observing these things. No satisfaction in noting that the divisions are deep and the repentance is shallow and the social tissue is fraying. These are not abstract patterns to be analyzed from a comfortable distance. They are the conditions of the world that real people are living inside. People who are tired and frightened and confused and genuinely trying, most of them to navigate an environment that has become genuinely difficult to navigate. The prophetic tradition at its best has always held these observations not as condemnations but as diagnoses, as honest descriptions of a condition that has a name, and a name means it can be understood, and being understood means it is not simply meaningless chaos. That is the particular comfort that the prophetic framework offers in the middle of social unraveling. Not that the unraveling isn't happening, but that it was anticipated, that it is part of a larger story that does not end in the unraveling. And now, having walked honestly through the landscape of crisis and division and hardened hearts, we are almost ready to turn toward that larger story, toward the segments that look not at the signs of distress but at the destination they are pointing toward. Almost. But not quite yet. First, there is just this moment. This room. This quiet. The world with all its division and its unrest and its unanswered catastrophes is out there somewhere, doing what it does. And you are here, breathing slowly, thoughts drifting, the weight of the day and the weight of all these ideas settling gently toward the floor. You have traveled a long way through this night. Through geopolitics and technology and warfare and natural disasters and the fraying of social bonds. You have held all of it with the patient, open attention of someone who finds the world genuinely interesting rather than simply threatening. That is a rare and valuable thing. We turned a corner in our last segment. We sat with the hardening of hearts and the shallowness of repentance and the deep, exhausting divisions running through the societies of our time. And we acknowledged honestly that these things are not comfortable observations. They are the texture of the world that real people are living inside right now. But we also said that the prophetic tradition holds these observations not as the final word. As diagnoses, not verdicts. As part of a larger story that does not end in the unraveling. And now we arrive at the part of that story that has captured human imagination more than perhaps any other. The part that sits at the end of the long road of signs and warnings and escalating pressures. The climax toward which the entire prophetic narrative, in the futurist reading at least, has been building. We arrive here gently, without sensationalism, without the breathless urgency that this material sometimes receives in popular treatments. Just a calm, unhurried walk through some of the most dramatic and most debated passages in all of religious literature. Settle in. Let your body be heavy and your breathing slow. What follows is ancient, and large, and worth approaching with a quality of stillness. At the center of the futurist prophetic scenario is a figure. A single human individual who, according to this reading of the texts, will emerge in the final chapter of history as the focal point of a global system of deception and control unlike anything the world has previously seen. The word Antichrist appears directly only a handful of times in the New Testament, in the letters of John, where it refers both to a coming individual and to a spirit of opposition to Christ already present in the world. But the figure described in those brief references is filled out considerably by other passages. Daniel describes a king who exalts himself above every god, who speaks against the God of gods, who prospers until the time of wrath is completed. Paul, in his second letter to the Thessalonians, describes a man of lawlessness, a son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called god or object of worship, taking his seat in the temple of God and proclaiming himself to be God. Revelation describes a beast rising from the sea, given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation, worshipped by all whose names have not been written in the book of life. Taken together, these passages sketch a figure of extraordinary charisma and extraordinary malevolence. Someone who does not arrive obviously evil but who comes, at least initially, offering something that looks like solutions. Like peace. Like the kind of strong, decisive leadership that a world exhausted by division and crisis might find desperately appealing. For those who have been watching the conditions we have surveyed across these segments, the institutional distrust, the political exhaustion, the yearning for something that simply works, the emergence of such a figure into such a landscape has a psychological plausibility that does not require any theological commitment to appreciate. The world we have been describing is, in certain important respects, a world that would be vulnerable to exactly this kind of appeal. The period over which this figure's influence reaches its full expression is described in the prophetic literature as a time of tribulation of unparalleled severity. Jesus himself, in the Olivet Discourse, used language that was deliberately extreme. Great distress, he said, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. If those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. The futurist reading, developed in detail across centuries of prophetic scholarship and popularized most widely in the 20th century, understands this period as a defined span of 7 years, drawn from a passage in the 9th chapter of Daniel describing 70 weeks of years in God's redemptive calendar. The final week, 7 years, is understood as the period of final crisis, divided into 2 halves, with the second half representing the period of most intense suffering that Jesus described. 7 years. In the context of a conversation about the sweep of human history from creation to consummation, it is a strikingly brief period. A single presidential term. A child's journey from birth to the beginning of primary school. And yet, in the prophetic framework, it is the period during which more changes than in any comparable span in all of recorded history. What those changes look like, the prophetic texts describe in imagery that is, depending on one's interpretive framework, either literal or symbolic or some combination of the two. Seals broken. Trumpets blown. Bowls poured out. Each sequence releasing something into the world. Plagues and famines and wars and cosmic disturbances. The earth pressed, in the imagery of the text, like grapes in a wine press. Geography reasserts itself near the end of the story. The place names become specific again, in a way that has always fascinated readers. The armies of the world, in Revelation's account of the final confrontation, converge on a location. In the original Greek, the word is Harmagedon, the mountain of Megiddo, a real place. An ancient plain in northern Israel, at the foot of a tell that archaeologists have excavated to find layer upon layer of ancient city, one built upon the ruins of another, across more than 5,000 years of continuous human habitation and conflict. Megiddo guards the most important pass through the Carmel Ridge. It has been the site of significant battles in antiquity. Napoleon, surveying the plain in the 18th century, reportedly described it as the most natural battleground on Earth. The geography that makes it strategically significant in the 21st century is the same geography that made it strategically significant in the 15th century before Christ. For the prophetic tradition, the convergence of the world's military powers at this specific location represents the final gathering of human force in opposition to something it cannot ultimately defeat. Not a conventional war between nations with competing interests, but something more fundamental. A final, climactic expression of the long human project of self-determination. Of the insistence that humanity can organize itself, govern itself, save itself without reference to the source from which it came. From the East, specifically, Revelation describes the movement of enormous forces toward this final gathering. The sixth bowl judgment describes the great river Euphrates drying up to prepare the way for the kings from the East and their armies, described in numbers, 200 million, that seemed fantastical to previous generations of readers and seem rather less so to a generation that knows the population sizes of the nations east of the Euphrates. The Euphrates River, which we have mentioned before in these segments as a significant prophetic landmark, runs through modern-day Turkey, Syria, and Iraq before emptying into the Persian Gulf. It has been, throughout recorded history, one of the great natural boundaries of the ancient world. The civilizations of Mesopotamia on one side. The civilizations further east and west on the other. Its drying, whether understood literally or as an image of the removal of natural barriers to the movement of forces, prepares the way for a convergence of global military power that the text presents as the final military gathering of human history. For those who have been watching the geopolitical realignments we surveyed in our earlier segments, the rising military and economic power of nations east of the Euphrates, the shifting alliances, the competition over the very waterways and trade corridors of that region, the geographical specificity of these ancient passages carries a contemporary resonance that is difficult to entirely dismiss. As the climax approaches, the prophetic literature reaches for the largest possible canvas. The disturbances are no longer merely earthly. They extend into the heavens. The sun darkened. The moon not giving its light. The stars falling. The powers of the heavens shaken. These images appear in the Olivet Discourse, in the book of Joel, in Isaiah, and in Revelation. Whether they describe literal astronomical events, or use the language of cosmic upheaval symbolically to convey the total destabilization of everything previously considered fixed and permanent, they communicate a single overwhelming impression: that what is coming is not merely a large version of the crises that have come before. It is something categorically different. A moment at which the ordinary framework within which human life has been conducted, the reliable rising and setting of the sun, the predictable cycles of light and dark, can no longer be taken for granted. Some commentators have suggested naturalistic mechanisms, the atmospheric effects of catastrophic volcanic eruptions, the electromagnetic consequences of extreme solar activity, the environmental aftermath of nuclear exchange, that could produce phenomena matching these descriptions. Others hold them as genuinely supernatural events that lie beyond naturalistic explanation. The tradition itself does not insist on resolution between these readings. It insists only that what is described is real, and that it is unprecedented, and that it is the immediate context within which the story reaches its resolution. And the economic and political systems that have been so central to our survey of the modern world, the global governance architecture, the financial networks, the megacity civilization, reach their own abrupt conclusion in the prophetic narrative. Babylon falls. That great city, that symbol of human achievement and human hubris, that concentration of wealth and power and commerce that had made the merchants of the earth rich and the nations drunk on her influence, she falls. And the text is precise about the timing. In 1 hour. The music stops. The ships stand off at a distance, the smoke of her burning rising in the distance, and those who had built their lives around her commerce weep and wail and cry out that in 1 hour such great wealth has been laid waste. We have visited this image before, in our segment on urbanization, and noted that the fragility of the systems on which megacity civilization depends makes sudden, catastrophic collapse a genuine possibility in purely secular terms. The prophetic literature is not primarily making a prediction about systemic risk. It is making a theological statement about the ultimate destiny of human civilization built on its own foundations, oriented around its own glory, answering to no authority higher than itself. But the two observations, the secular and the prophetic, have come, in our generation, to inhabit the same landscape. The city that is impressive enough to be described as Babylon and fragile enough to fall in an hour is a city that our generation, for the first time, knows how to build. And then, beneath all of this, beneath the geopolitical convergences and the cosmic disturbances and the falling of systems, the prophetic narrative identifies something that it treats as the deepest reality of the final hour. Not a military confrontation between nations. Not a systemic collapse. But a confrontation of a different order entirely. A final, ultimate expression of the contest that the biblical story has been narrating since its earliest pages. Between the human project of autonomous self-definition and the claim of a creator who made human beings for himself and has been, across the entire sweep of history, working to bring them home. Armageddon, in the prophetic reading, is not ultimately a battle between armies. It is the moment at which that deeper contest becomes fully visible. At which the forces that have been organizing human civilization in opposition to God gather themselves for a final assertion, and meet something they were not equipped to defeat. The imagery that follows in the prophetic texts is not of a prolonged struggle. It is of an appearance, a return, a word spoken, and the long, complicated, painful, beautiful, terrible story of human civilization arriving, at last, at the moment it was always moving toward. That is a large thing to hold in the mind at the end of a long, quiet evening. The largest thing, perhaps, that human language has ever tried to describe. And you do not need to hold it tightly. You do not need to resolve it or systematize it or decide exactly what you believe about every detail of the picture we have just walked through. These are the most debated passages in all of religious literature, and they have occupied the finest theological minds of 2 millennia without producing complete consensus. What you can simply do is let the largeness of it settle over you like something vast and quiet. Like a sky full of stars seen from a dark field, far from the city lights. You don't need to name every star. You just need to stand underneath them and feel how large the sky is. That is enough. Because the prophetic narrative does not end in Armageddon. It ends somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that the tradition describes with a tenderness that stands in sharp contrast to everything that precedes it. That is what is waiting for you, just ahead. But right now, you are here. And here is peaceful. And the vast, ancient story is doing its patient work in the world, entirely without your assistance, while you do the quiet, necessary work of rest. Let your eyes be closed. Let your breathing be slow. Let the weight of the world's great story rest on the shoulders that were made to carry it. Yours were made for something else tonight.